A volley of rifle fire tore through the quiet air over the Kentucky River, and the man they called Bad Tom Baker fell. The one-armed king of Clay County, a figure whispered about with a mix of terror and awe, disappeared into the murky water. History calls it the end of a feud. But was it just a family squabble over a stolen pig or a stray card game? Or was it the assassination of a tyrant who had turned the law into his personal weapon and ruled an entire county through sheer brutal force? Today, we dig past the headlines to find the truth behind Appalachia's most feared family dynasty. To understand the Bakers, you have to understand the land that shaped them. Clay County, Kentucky, after the Civil War, was a world unto itself. Carved by deep, misty valleys the locals call hollers, it was a place where the modern world's grip was weak. The people here, mostly descendants of tough Scottish-Irish settlers, lived by a code much older than any state constitution. Family wasn't just important, it was everything. Your clan was your nation, your church, and your army, all rolled into one. Life was hard, scraped from thin soil and dense forests. Logging and salt mining were the only real industries, and in a place with so little power wasn't measured in dollars, but in influence. The most coveted prize was the sheriff's badge, because whoever held it didn't just enforce the law, they were the law. They controlled taxes, settled disputes, and decided who prospered and who starved. It was a king's throne in a kingdom of log cabins and dirt roads. This isolated world was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Civil War had split communities down the middle. Neighbor fought neighbor, and those wounds never truly healed. The Bakers had largely sided with the Union, while many of their future rivals, like the Howards, had fought for the Confederacy. They returned from the war not as countrymen, but as vanquished foes and bitter victors, forced to live side by side in these tight, unforgiving hollers. Every day was a fragile truce. Men worked their land with a rifle never far from reach. They gathered at the county seat of Manchester with pistols tucked in their belts, their eyes constantly scanning for the face of an old enemy. They were proud, stubborn people, steeped in a tradition where an insult to one was an insult to all, a debt that could only be paid in blood. They didn't know it yet, but their way of life was standing on the edge of a cliff. The world of quiet mountain self-reliance was about to be shattered by a feud so brutal it would become a legend. A small grudge, born from this soil steeped in hate, was about to grow into a war that would drench the courthouse steps in red and leave a legacy of fear that would echo for 100 years. History loves a clean starting point, a single gunshot, a stolen kiss, one insult that tips the world into chaos. But in the mountains, feuds rarely have a single beginning. They fester. They grow in the dark like mold, feeding on old wounds and whispered grudges. The Baker-Howard feud was no different. Some old-timers swear it started over a card game when a Baker accused a Howard of cheating, and words gave way to fists, then knives. Others say it was something as simple and as serious as a stolen boar. The truth is, it doesn't matter which spark lit the fuse. The whole county was a powder keg that had been sitting since the Civil War, just waiting for any reason to explode. And the man who struck the match was Thomas Baker, known to history as Bad Tom. He wasn't just another brawler in a long line of them. He was different. There was a cold fire in his eyes, a charisma that drew men to him, and a ruthlessness that made them fear him. He'd lost an arm in a sawmill accident, but this only added to his mythic stature. With one hand, they said, he could handle a rifle better than any two-handed man in the state. He was the living embodiment of his family's pride and their rage, and he didn't just join the simmering conflict, he became its heart. The feud might have remained a series of back-alley brawls and drunken shootouts, if not for one thing: politics. Bad Tom saw that true power wasn't just in the barrel of a gun, but in the sheriff's badge that could legitimize its use. He ran for sheriff, and through a campaign of charm, intimidation, and likely a few backroom deals, he won. This was the point of no return. The law was no longer a neutral force in Clay County. It was now a weapon pointed directly at the heart of the Howard clan and their allies. Suddenly, the game had changed. This was no longer just about family honor. It was about survival. For the Howards, facing a sheriff who was also their sworn enemy, there was no court of appeal, no neutral ground. Their only path was to fight back with the same ferocity. The threats, once muttered in saloons, became open declarations of war. A loaded cartridge might be left on a windowsill, a silent promise of what was to come. A rider might gallop past a Howard cabin in the dead of night, firing a single shot into the darkness, not to kill, but to remind them that they were never safe. The time for talking was over. Under the reign of Bad Tom, the streets of Manchester, the county seat, became a theatre of war. Court days were the most dangerous. The air would grow thick with tension as the armed clans gathered, their eyes locked on each other across the town square. It wasn't a matter of if violence would erupt, but when. And one day, it did, in a way that would be seared into the county's memory forever. As the Howards and their allies stood on the courthouse steps, the world exploded in a deafening roar of gunfire. From concealed positions, the Bakers unleashed a coordinated volley. For a moment, there was only the thunder of rifles and the acrid smell of gunpowder smoke. Then came the screams. Men who had been standing tall moments before crumpled to the ground. The white columns of the courthouse, symbols of law and order, were stained with something other than rain. When the gunsmoke finally cleared and a ringing silence fell, the ground was littered with the fallen. The law hadn't just been broken, it had been executed in broad daylight. But the horror wasn't confined to these public spectacles. The war followed people home. It crept onto their porches in the dead of night, leaving a single bullet on a windowsill, a silent promise. Or worse, a small, crudely carved coffin, a message more chilling than any spoken threat. A family would be sitting down to supper, and a shot would ring out from the darkness, shattering a window pane. The bullet wasn't meant to hit anyone. It was meant to shatter their peace, to remind them that they were never safe, to exhaust their nerves until they broke. The mountains, once a source of comfort, became an enemy. Every bend in the road, every dense patch of woods, could be hiding an ambush. The Bakers knew these hills like the back of their one remaining hand. They would strike from the trees like ghosts and melt back into the forest, leaving behind only chaos and fear. Travel between hollers became a life-or-death gamble. Perhaps the darkest tale whispered about Bad Tom was the one about his own cousin. The story goes that the man showed a moment of weakness, a flicker of cowardice in the face of the enemy. For Bad Tom, this was a betrayal worse than any other. He summoned the man to the family home, and as the cousin stood on the doorstep, a single shot echoed through the holler. It was a message to everyone, friend and foe alike. In the Baker clan, loyalty was absolute, and the price for breaking the code was paid on the spot, without hesitation. After the smoke cleared from the courthouse steps, a new kind of silence fell over Clay County. It wasn't peace, it was the suffocating quiet of absolute fear. Doors were bolted, windows were shuttered, and the streets of Manchester emptied as if a plague had swept through. The only ones who moved freely were the Bakers and their allies, who walked with the swagger of conquering heroes. The law, which had bled out on the town square, was now whatever Bad Tom Baker said it was. For the survivors of the Howard clan, grief quickly hardened into a cold, unbending resolve. They carried their dead back to their family plots in the quiet hollers, but they weren't just burying their kin. They were burying any hope of conventional justice. To appeal to Sheriff Baker to investigate a crime committed by the Bakers was not just futile, it was a death sentence. They knew then that the war would not be won in a courtroom or on a ballot. It would only end when Bad Tom Baker was in the ground. The fear was a poison that seeped into every corner of life. Neighbors who had known each other for generations stopped speaking, their eyes averting in the street lest a friendly word be misinterpreted as taking a side. Business ground to a halt. The mountains that had once been a sanctuary became a prison, and the legend of Bad Tom grew with every whispered story. People said he couldn't be killed, that he'd made a deal with the devil for his one-armed marksmanship. In the flickering firelight of their cabins, people began to believe that he wasn't a man at all, but a spirit of vengeance sent to punish the county for its sins. But the gunshots in Manchester echoed far beyond the hills of Clay County. Newspapers in Frankfurt and Louisville began to run sensational stories about bloody Clay, painting it as a savage land ruled by a one-armed tyrant. The state government, long content to let the mountain counties manage their own affairs, could no longer ignore the anarchy. The governor was embarrassed. Rewards were quietly offered for information, and the first whispers of sending in the state militia began to circulate. The outside world was finally starting to peer into the heart of darkness that Clay County had become. This external pressure, combined with the desperation of his enemies, sealed Bad Tom's fate. His opponents realized they couldn't outfight him, and they couldn't outvote him. They had only one option left. In secret meetings, deep in the woods, a plan was forged. It wouldn't be a fair fight, because a fair fight with Tom Baker was one you lost. It would be an ambush. They began to watch his movements, learning his routines, waiting for the perfect moment to cut the head off the snake and end his bloody reign for good. With Bad Tom Baker's body lost to the Kentucky River, you might think the story was over, but it wasn't. His death wasn't an act of law, it was an assassination. And now, the law of men finally came to Clay County. The state, embarrassed and angry, sent in troops and prosecutors. The war of ambushes and shootouts was over. The war of witness stands and gavels was about to begin. The courthouse, once a battlefield, was now to be a place of judgment. The trials that followed were a spectacle, a clash of two entirely different worlds. Armed state militiamen stood guard, their faces grim, watching a crowd that was divided by an invisible line of hatred. On one side sat the remaining Bakers, on the other, the Howards and their allies. In the middle were the city lawyers in their pressed suits, trying to apply abstract legal principles to a conflict fueled by generations of raw, personal vengeance. For the mountain folk packed into the gallery, it was a strange and foreign circus, where truth seemed less important than procedure. The men in the dock were a study in defiance. Whether Baker or Howard, they showed little remorse. They sat with a stoic dignity, their faces carved from the same hard Appalachian rock as their homes. To them, this wasn't a trial for murder. It was a trial of survival. They looked at the judge and the jury, not with the eyes of guilty men, but with the weary gaze of soldiers who had fought a long and brutal war, only to be judged by outsiders who had never spent a single night in the trenches. They didn't plead for mercy, because mercy wasn't a currency they understood. The verdicts, when they came, were as messy and complicated as the feud itself. Some men were convicted, sent away to rot in a Frankfurt prison, becoming martyrs to their families. Others, even those known to have pulled a trigger, were acquitted. Witnesses suddenly couldn't remember faces. Juries of local men who had to live in these hollers long after the judge went home delivered verdicts that defied the evidence. The law came to Clay County, but it found that the old codes of silence and clan loyalty were stronger than any prosecutor's argument. In the end, the state declared the feud officially over. The newspapers reported that justice had been served. But was it? For the people who lived it, the court's justice felt hollow. It didn't bring back the dead. For every man sent to prison, another known killer walked free. The trials didn't bring closure. They just forced the hatred underground, where it would simmer for another generation. The law of men had imposed a fragile peace, but the justice of the mountains, a justice of blood for blood, was left unfinished, an angry ghost that would haunt the hollers for years to come. The trials ended, the troops went home, and a quiet, exhausted peace settled over Clay County. The Baker dynasty, once a force that could command a private army and bend the law to its will, crumbled. Without the iron fist of Bad Tom to hold it together, the clans scattered like ashes in the wind. Some of his sons and lieutenants went to prison. Others moved away, changing their names to escape the shadow of their family's bloody reputation. The name that once inspired terror now became a quiet mark of a past best left buried. But the past is never truly buried in these mountains. It just sleeps. If you go to Manchester today, you'll see a modern town. The courthouse that once ran with blood has likely been renovated, its columns scrubbed clean. But if you look closely, the real story is still there. It's in the small, forgotten family cemeteries hidden up in the hollows, where weathered headstones bear the names of young men who didn't die of old age. The dates tell a silent story of a war that history books barely mention. The land itself seems to hold the memory. And if you find an old man sitting on his porch and you ask him about the feuds, you'll see a change in his eyes. The stories are still told, not as history, but as cautionary tales whispered on long winter nights. They'll tell you about Bad Tom, the one-armed king, and how he ruled this county with fear. The official records are sparse, but the oral history, passed down from grandfather to grandson, is rich and terrifying. The name Baker is no longer a threat. It's a legend, a ghost that haunts the local memory. Most of the cars that drive the winding roads of Clay County are just passing through, their drivers unaware of the ghosts that linger in the shade of the trees. But the mountains remember everything. They remember the gun smoke and the screams. The Kentucky River still flows, the same dark water that swallowed the body of Bad Tom Baker, taking his secrets with him. The feud is over, but its echo remains, a permanent part of the landscape, a whisper in the Appalachian wind. So we return to where we began, with the body of Bad Tom Baker sinking into the Kentucky River. Was his story just another bloody chapter in a family feud, born from a stolen pig or a crooked card game? The truth is, it was so much more than that. It was the story of how a man, forged in the fires of isolation and clan warfare, took the ancient mountain code of honor and twisted it into a crown. He wasn't just a feudist, he was a king, and Clay County was his brutal, bloody kingdom. His death wasn't just an act of revenge, it was a regicide, the only way his subjects knew to end a tyrant's reign. The story of the Baker dynasty is a dark mirror held up to the heart of Appalachia. It's a testament to the indomitable spirit of its people, their fierce loyalty, their stubborn pride, and their refusal to bow to any authority but their own. But it's also a terrifying lesson in what happens when that spirit is poisoned by poverty and old hatreds. It shows us how thin the line is between a man protecting his family and a man destroying his community, between justice and vengeance. This isn't just a tale of outlaws and shootouts, it's a story about a forgotten America, a world where the only law that mattered was the law of blood. The men who fought and died in these hills weren't simple villains. They were complex, desperate men, living by the only code they'd ever been taught. Their legacy is a reminder that the past is never as clean or simple as the history books would have us believe. And that is why we must keep these stories alive, pulled from the shadows of the misty hollows. Because they remind us of the fire and the blood that shaped this land, and of the ghosts who still walk here. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. In the deepest folds of the Appalachian Mountains, there are valleys and hollows that have names. Names whispered by the old folks. Names like Moan Hollow. They say it wasn't the wind that gave it that name. It was the sorrow that soaked into the ground, a sorrow that belonged to one family, the Howards. For generations, their story was told not in letters, but in bruises and broken bones. A rage passed from father to son, as sure as their blue eyes and stubborn chin. The legends say it was a curse, a witch's dying breath, or a deal made with the devil in a dark coal mine. But what if the truth is something colder, something more terrifying than any ghost story? What if the monster wasn't a spirit from the woods, but a demon that lived right inside their own home, passed down like a family heirloom? Today, we will separate the rumors from the facts and find out what really happened to the men of the Howard family. Was it a curse that doomed them, or was it a chain of pain they forged themselves? Before it was called Moan Hollow, it was just a nameless fold in the earth, a sanctuary carved by a silver creek. The mountains rose up on all sides like silent green-robed giants, their peaks shrouded in a perpetual blue haze. It was a true oasis, hidden in the wild and rugged lands. The forests were thick with chestnut and oak, teeming with deer and turkey. The soil in the narrow bottomland was black and rich. It was a place where a man willing to work until his hands bled could build a life from nothing. And that's exactly what Jedediah Howard came to do. He was the first of them, a man who carried the chill of the Scottish Highlands in his bones and a fierce hunger in his heart. He'd left the old world behind, a world of landlords and famines, and saw in this untamed Appalachian wilderness a kingdom waiting to be claimed. He was a hard man, to be sure, with eyes as cold and clear as a winter stream, but his toughness was first turned against the land itself. He felled trees that were ancient when his grandfather was a boy. He broke the soil with his own back, and he raised a small, sturdy cabin stone by stone. For a time, there was peace in that hollow. Jedediah took a wife, a quiet woman named Elspeth, and soon the silence of the valley was broken by the cry of their firstborn son, Silas. Their life was a rhythm of seasons and survival. They were governed by the rising of the sun and the ache in their muscles. They feared the hard frost and the dry summer, but they feared little else. They were poor, but their barn was full. They were isolated, but they were self-sufficient. Jedediah had done it. He had carved out a piece of the world that was his, and his alone. But the mountains keep secrets. And the story the neighbors told was that this piece of the world hadn't been empty when Jedediah arrived. They said an old Cherokee woman had lived there, a healer who knew the secrets of the herbs that grew in the dark places of the woods. The official record says Jedediah bought the land fair and square, a simple transaction. But the whispers said something different. They said the deal was less of a purchase and more of an eviction. They said she didn't leave quietly, and so a shadow lingered at the edge of their hard-won peace. Sometimes, Elspeth would swear she saw a flicker of movement by the ancient oak at the edge of the property. At night, when the fire burned low, the wind blowing through the gorge would sometimes sound like a mournful voice, a lament. Jedediah Howard had built his home, but he didn't know that the foundation was laid on a grievance. He believed he had conquered the wilderness, but he hadn't yet learned that some debts aren't paid with money, but with blood. The storm was gathering, and it would bear his family's name. Now, in the mountains, a good neighbor is worth more than a good mule, but Jedediah Howard never found one. The closest family, the Suttries, lived a mile down the creek, and they looked upon Jedediah's prosperity with a sour eye. The patriarch, Elias Suttry, was a man whose family had been hunting and trapping in these hills for 2 generations before the Howards arrived. He told anyone who would listen that the fertile bottomland Jedediah had claimed was promised to him, that he'd been on the verge of filing the deed himself. The Suttrys felt the land had been stolen right from under them, and their resentment simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. The old wound festered over a property line. A small creek separated their lands, and after a spring flood one year, the water changed its course, carving a new channel that gave a few more acres of rich soil to the Howards. To Jedediah, it was an act of God. To Elias Suttry, it was theft by water and a sign of Howard's devil's luck. It came to a head at the crossroads store, where words, sharp and heavy as stones, were thrown. No punches were exchanged, not yet, but a line was drawn. Sutri swore that creek would one day run with more than just rainwater. It wasn't spoken of loudly after that, but memories in the mountains are as long as a winter's night. This bitter dispute was the dry kindling, and the legend of the Cherokee woman was the spark. The Sutris and their kin started repeating the story, adding their own dark embellishments. When one of Jedediah's cows took sick and died, it wasn't colic, it was the curse. When a late frost killed the Howard's apple blossoms, it wasn't the weather, it was the witch's revenge. The story of the curse became a social weapon, isolating the Howards and marking them as other. People who had once nodded a greeting now looked away. The Howard land, once seen as a testament to hard work, was now viewed as a place of bad blood. And so, the hollow became a pressure cooker. Inside the Howard cabin, the whispers from the outside world turned Jedediah's heart to granite. He saw enemies in every shadow. His wife Elspeth grew more withdrawn, her silence a constant, fearful prayer. And young Silas, he was being raised on a diet of resentment and suspicion. His father taught him to read the weather and to mend a fence, but the real lessons were unspoken. He learned that the world was hostile. He learned that a Howard trusts no one but another Howard. And he learned that any sign of weakness would be seized upon by your enemies. He was being forged in a crucible of suspicion and pride, being shaped into the perfect instrument to carry the family's legacy, whether it was a blessing or a curse. The harvest festival that year was supposed to be a time of truce. For one day, families set aside their grievances to celebrate the bounty of the land. There was music from a fiddle and banjo, the sweet smell of roasting meat, and the amber glow of moonshine being passed in a jar. And in that brief moment of peace, a dangerous seed took root. Silas Howard, now a young man with his father's solid build but his mother's quiet eyes, saw Sarah Sutri. She was Elias Sutri's youngest daughter, and a young man's heart doesn't care much for property lines or old grudges. They stole glances across the crowd, their secret a fragile spark in the midst of a simmering hate. That spark became a fire when the dancing started. Under the light of the harvest moon, Silas asked Sarah to dance. It was a reckless, defiant act. For the length of one song, they were just a boy and a girl, lost in the music, the world of their fathers fading away. But it was a world that wouldn't be ignored. Sarah's two older brothers, Caleb and Joshua, saw it all. They were their father's sons through and through, barrel-chested and quick to anger, and they saw a Howard's hands on their sister as the ultimate trespass. The music hadn't even finished before they pulled Sarah away and cornered Silas behind the barn. The first words weren't about the dance. They were about the land, the creek, the old rumors. They called him the son of a thief and a witch lover. They sneered that the curse was already showing in his eyes. Silas, raised on a strict diet of Howard pride, stood his ground. He didn't say a word, but his silence was louder than any shout. The taunts escalated, his family's name dragged through the mud with every curse. Then Joshua Sutri shoved him hard against the rough-hewn planks of the barn wall. Silas shoved back, and the festival was over. It was 2 against 1, a brutal, clumsy fight fueled by moonshine and generations of bad blood. Silas was strong, but they were stronger. They beat him to his knees, his face in the dirt. But as Caleb raised a heavy boot to stomp his hand, Silas's desperate eyes landed on a heavy wooden mallet left behind from setting up the tents. With a guttural roar, he lunged, swinging the mallet in a blind arc. There was a sickening crack of wood against bone. Caleb Sutri collapsed to the ground, his arm bent at an unnatural angle, a shard of white bone peeking through his skin. Blood, dark in the moonlight, soaked into the dry earth. The screams that followed silenced the fiddle for good. The community scattered, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. Elias Sutri, his face a mask of pure fury, cradled his screaming son and pointed a trembling finger at Silas. "You'll pay for this, Howard," he choked out. "Your whole damned family will pay." Back in his own cabin that night, Jedediah didn't tend to his son's cuts and bruises. He looked at the blood on Silas's knuckles, at the fire in his eyes, and saw not a mistake, but a beginning. The whispers were over. The time for waiting was done. In both the Howard and Suttree homes that night, rifles were taken down from the wall and carefully, methodically cleaned. The first drops of blood had fallen, watering the seeds of a war that would consume them all. The revenge came not with a warning, but with the quiet mist of the following dawn. Jedediah Howard was at the woodpile, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar heartbeat in the hollow. He was splitting kindling for the morning fire, a simple, honest chore. The air was still and damp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and wet earth. Then came a sound that didn't belong, a sharp crack that wasn't a breaking branch. The axe fell from Jedediah's hand, its blade burying itself in the dirt. He crumpled without a sound, a slow, heavy fall onto the very soil he had claimed as his own. From the cabin, Elspeth heard it, a mother's instinct, a wife's dread. She threw open the rough-hewn door, her question dying on her lips as she saw the dark shapes of Elias Suttree and his son Joshua emerging from the tree line, rifles in hand. The air filled with a blood-curdling scream, and then there was a dull thud, and the scream was cut short. A second crack echoed the first. Then an unnatural silence fell over the hollow, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all other sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of the birds, everything. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing quiet. Silas was down by the creek, checking a rabbit snare he'd set the night before. He heard the two shots, spaced just far enough apart to be deliberate. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He didn't think, he ran. He sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at his face, his lungs burning. As he broke through the clearing, the sight of his home stopped him cold. The cabin door was swinging wide open, like a gaping mouth. There were no voices, no movement. The chickens were scattered across the yard, clucking in frantic terror. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was the silence of a place where life had just been violently erased. He crept inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. The single room was a scene of pure chaos. A table was overturned, chairs were splintered. A sack of flour had been torn open, casting a ghostly white powder over everything. And there, in the middle of the floor, a single dark boot print was pressed into the spilled flour. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a splash of crimson against the stark white. Near the cold hearth, his mother's favorite wool shawl, the one she was always mending, was cast aside in a heap. He backed out of the cabin, a silent denial screaming in his mind. And then he saw him. His father lay near the woodpile, a place of work, of life. He looked smaller somehow. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the misty sky he would never see again. The world for Silas shrank to that single still image. His father, the unmovable mountain of a man, now just a broken thing on the ground. In that moment, something inside Silas Howard broke. Or perhaps something was forged. The fear, the grief, it was all there, but it was instantly flash-frozen by a rage so pure and cold it burned. The tears would not come. The boy who had danced with Sarah Suttree under the harvest moon was gone, buried in the ashes of his home. In his place stood the son of Jedediah Howard, a vessel for a generation of hate, now filled to the brim. He didn't run to his father. He didn't cry out his mother's name. He walked, slowly and deliberately, to the woodpile. He looked down at his father's still face, the face that had taught him that the world was a hard and unforgiving place. Then he bent down. His hand closed around the smooth, worn handle of the fallen axe. As he lifted it, its weight felt familiar, righteous. The curse, whether real or imagined, had found its new champion. Silas Howard stood alone in the clearing, the axe in his hand feeling less like a tool and more like a part of his own arm. he did not weep. Tears were a luxury, and the price of vengeance was paid in sweat and resolve. With a grim, mechanical determination, he went to the small barn and retrieved 2 shovels. He chose a spot under the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the one his mother had always admired. And he began to dig. For hours, the only sound in Moan Hollow was the scrape and thud of a shovel biting into the earth, a solitary, heartbreaking rhythm. He carried his parents, one by one, and laid them to rest. He filled the graves himself, tamping down the soil with the back of his shovel, his movements precise and unhurried. There were no prayers said, no final words spoken. The act itself was the only eulogy. When the grim task was done, he did not go back into the cabin. He stood at the threshold and looked in at the scene of desecration, the spilled flour, the broken furniture, his mother's discarded shawl. This was no longer his home. It was a monument to a promise made in blood. He turned his back on it, leaving the door to swing on its hinges, an open invitation for the wind and the rain to come in and reclaim the place. He took only his father's rifle from the wall, a pouch of shot, a powder horn, and the axe. He walked away from the hollow without a single look back, melting into the deep woods that bordered his land. The hollow fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of a tomb. Word travels slowly in the mountains, but it travels surely. A few days later, a traveling preacher making his circuit found the Howard homestead unnervingly quiet. He saw the 2 fresh mounds of earth under the oak tree and knew instantly what they were. He didn't linger. He spurred his horse and carried the news to the nearest settlement. The story spread like a fever. It wasn't the killing that shocked people. Feuds and violence were a known part of life. It was the manner of it. The killing of a woman. An ambush at dawn. It was an act without honor, and it struck a chord of fear in the scattered community. Families who had feuds of their own looked at their neighbors with new eyes. Locks were bolted that had never been used before. The county sheriff, a portly man named Abernathy, who preferred settling disputes with talk rather than a gun, eventually made the ride out to the hollow. He saw the graves, noted the abandoned cabin, and then paid a visit to the Suttree family. Elias and his sons met him on their porch, their faces like stone masks. They denied everything. They'd been tending their own land, they said, and hadn't seen a soul. With no witnesses and no bodies to examine, Sheriff Abernathy's hands were tied. He made some notes in a dusty ledger, issued a stern warning about mountain justice, and rode away. The law in those mountains moved with the speed of an old man walking uphill, and in this case, it had come to a dead stop. But the story wasn't over. The community knew it. The Suttrees certainly knew it. Silas Howard was gone, but he wasn't dead. He had been swallowed by the mountains, the same ancient, unforgiving wilderness that had forged his father. He was out there, somewhere in the endless ridges and dark ravines. The manhunt had begun, but it wasn't the law that was doing the hunting. A ghost was now stalking Moan Hollow, and Elias Suttree and his sons began to understand that the 2 shots they had fired at dawn were not an ending, but the beginning of a reckoning. Every snapped twig in the woods, every shadow that moved at dusk, now held a terrifying new possibility. Silas Howard was no longer a name, but a whisper on the wind. There was no posse. Sheriff Abernathy had declared the matter closed, a family tragedy best left to the ghosts and the mountains. The hunt that began was a far more personal and primal affair. Elias Suttree and his remaining sons, Joshua and the one-armed Caleb, became both the hunters and the hunted. Their farm became a fortress, and they became its prisoners. They barred the windows at night and took turns standing watch, rifles cradled in their arms, their gazes fixed on the dark, whispering tree line that separated them from their unseen enemy. They were hunting a ghost, a boy they had created and then unleashed. But Silas Howard was no ghost. He was flesh and blood, and he was perfectly at home. The mountains that the Sutries now saw as a terrifying wall of shadow, Silas saw as his sanctuary and his accomplice. He had been raised in these woods. He knew the hidden game trails, the secret springs, the shallow caves where a man could disappear. The mountains had taken Silas Howard in, adopted him as one of their own. He moved like a deer, lived off the land, and his senses became as sharp as a hawk's. He became a roomer with a rifle, a phantom whose presence was felt in the cold dread that settled over the Sutrie homestead. Silas did not launch a direct assault. He was waging a war not on their bodies, but on their minds. The torment began with small, deliberate cruelties. One morning, Elias found a freshly killed rabbit hanging from his porch rail, skinned with the same distinctive knife stroke his own father had taught him. A few nights later, a rock shattered the kitchen window in the dead of night, and when they rushed outside, there was nothing but the chirping of crickets. They started hearing things, the distant rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood deep in the forest, a low whistle on the wind that sounded like a tune Silas used to favor. He was everywhere and nowhere, a constant invisible pressure that began to fray their nerves raw. The Sutrie brothers, once bold and arrogant, became twitchy and paranoid. Caleb, his useless arm a constant reminder of the feud's beginning, was consumed by nightmares. Joshua, the more hot-headed of the two, grew reckless with fury. He'd fire his rifle into the shadows at the slightest sound, his shouts echoing unanswered in the night. The forest that had been his backyard his entire life was now a deadly labyrinth with a monster at its center. The father, Elias, saw his sons unraveling and his own iron will turning to rust. The fear was a poison, and Silas was letting it work its way deep into their souls before he delivered the final blow. The breaking point came a month into the siege. Driven by a mix of rage and cabin fever, Joshua Sutrie declared he was going to hunt the hunter. Ignoring his father's pleas, he took his rifle and stormed into the woods, vowing to return with Silas Howard's scalp. He stalked through the familiar forest for hours, his anger making him clumsy, his shouts making him an easy target. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, he found himself in a part of the woods he didn't recognize. A sudden snap of a twig behind him made him spin around. He saw nothing. A cold dread, colder than any winter morning, washed over him. He knew in that instant that he was not the hunter. He was the prey, and he had walked right into the center of the web. They found him at dawn, not 50 yards from his own tree line. Elias Sutrie, his face a pale, haggard mask, followed the trail of broken branches his son had left. He didn't find a man. He found what was left. Joshua was slumped against the base of a massive pine tree. There was no sign of a struggle, no gunshot wound. A single dark mark on his temple showed where the butt of a rifle had struck with brutal final force. But it was the other detail that made Elias's blood run cold. Lying neatly on Joshua's chest was the family axe, the one Silas had taken from his father's woodpile. Its blade was clean. It had not been used to kill, but to send a message. One Sutrie was down. The ghost had a taste for blood, and his work was not yet finished. There was no trial held in the county courthouse for the death of Joshua Sutrie. The only court in session was the court of public opinion, and the verdict was delivered in hushed tones and averted eyes. When Elias and Caleb carried the pine box to the small family plot on the hill behind their house, only a handful of distant cousins came to stand with them. The rest of the community stayed away, their absence a silent, damning judgment. They weren't mourning Joshua, they were watching the Sutrie family be consumed by a fire of their own making. The law of men had failed, and now the older, harsher law of the mountains was handing down its sentence. The Sutrie homestead became a courtroom and a prison all in one. Elias and Caleb were the accused, and Silas Howard was the unseen judge, jury, and executioner. The farm began to die around them. Fences sagged, weeds choked the cornfields, and the livestock grew thin from neglect. How could they work the fields when their eyes were constantly scanning the tree line? How could they sleep when every creak of the floorboards sounded like an intruder? Elias, the once proud patriarch who ruled his family with an iron fist, was reduced to a hollow-eyed old man, watching his world crumble one terror at a time. The legacy he had fought to build was being systematically dismantled by the ghost of a boy he had wronged. Caleb, however, was haunted by more than just fear. With his useless dangling arm, a constant aching reminder of his role in starting the feud, his spirit began to break. He started drinking heavily, seeking courage in a jar of corn liquor that only brought forth the demons of his guilt. In his drunken stupors, he would whisper his mother-in-law's name, swearing he saw her face in the shadows. He raved about a curse, not the one they had mockingly pinned on the Howards, but a real one, a curse of blood they had brought upon themselves that day at dawn. The trial within the Suttree home reached its climax one moonless night. Fueled by whiskey and terror, Caleb finally turned on his father. He stood in the middle of the cabin, his one good hand trembling, and screamed the truth into the suffocating silence. He shrieked about the look in Elspeth Howard's eyes, about the silence after the second shot, about the blood on their hands that would never wash away. "It's him. He's not a man. He's a spirit. And he's come for us." Elias tried to silence him, to slap the hysteria out of him, but the dam of denial had burst. The truth, ugly and raw, now filled the space between them. The verdict was delivered just before the next sunrise. Caleb Suttree, stripped of his bravado and his sanity, seemed to find a strange and sudden calm. He walked out onto the porch, unarmed, his face pale in the grey pre-dawn light. He took a deep breath of the cold mountain air, and then, in a voice that was not a shout, but a weary plea, he called out a single name into the mist-shrouded woods. Silas. He stood there, a man offering himself up to the inevitable. A moment passed, then another. And then, from the dark, silent wall of trees, a single shot rang out, sharp and final. It was an answer, an execution, a mercy. Was this justice? A circuit judge would have called it murder. But in the hollows and hills, where life was cheap and honor was everything, the story was told differently. They said Silas Howard was simply balancing the scales. He had taken an eye for an eye, a son for a mother, a brother for a father. Elias Suttree was now utterly alone, a king of a dead and haunted kingdom, left to live with the ghosts he had created. The law of men had never laid a hand on him, but the justice of the mountains had delivered a sentence far worse than a hangman's noose. It had taken everything. Elias Suttree didn't die from a bullet. He died from silence. He lived out his remaining years in that hollow, a ghost in his own home, surrounded by the ghosts of his sons. His land went fallow, and his name withered on the vine. When he finally passed, no one was there to mark the occasion. The Suttree line, once a source of pride, ended in a weedy, forgotten grave on a lonely hillside. Their story became a cautionary tale about the price of hate. And Silas Howard, the avenging angel of the hollow, walked out of the mountains and into a bigger, bloodier war. When the nation split apart, he joined the Union Army, perhaps seeing in the chaos of the Civil War a place where a man with his particular skills could belong. He saw the horrors of Gettysburg, a slaughter that made his family feud look like a schoolyard scuffle. But the war didn't wash away his sins. It just baptized him in a new kind of hell. He returned a broken man, quiet and cold, the fire of righteous vengeance replaced by the hollow emptiness of trauma. It was this Silas, the soldier with the haunted eyes, who would eventually take a wife and have a son of his own, passing down not a name, but a darkness. The curse had found its vessel for the next generation. If you were to go looking for Moan Hollow today, you wouldn't find it on any map. But the locals could point the way. The Suttree place is gone, reclaimed entirely by the forest. A place where people say the weeds grow a little too thick and the birds sing a little less sweetly. The Howard cabin was swallowed by the woods too. All that remains today is a pile of moss-covered foundation stones and a single stubborn chimney standing like a tombstone for a home. They call it the Howard Chimney now, a local landmark where teenagers dare each other to spend the night. And the 2 mounds of earth under the ancient oak tree? They are still there, sunken and subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But they are there. The paper trail of this tragedy is thin, a few lines in a dusty county ledger about a land dispute. But the mountains have a longer memory. The story of the Howards and the Suttrees isn't written in ink. It's carved into the landscape itself, in the names people whisper, in the ruins they avoid after dark. Though most people have forgotten the details, the sorrow has soaked into the soil and the mountains remember everything. So we come back to the question that started it all, the question whispered around campfires in these mountains for over a century. Was the Howard family doomed by a supernatural curse? It's a powerful story, the idea of a witch's hex or a deal with the devil. It gives a name to an evil that feels too big and too relentless to be human. But the truth, as it often is simpler and somehow far more tragic. The real curse wasn't a whisper on the wind. The real curse was the silence between neighbors nursing old grudges, the silence of a man who can't speak his pain, and the ringing, final silence after a gunshot. This is a story not just of cruelty, but of the formidable, unyielding Appalachian spirit, a spirit forged in hardship and isolation. It's a story of the fierce pride that can build a life on a steep mountainside with nothing but bare hands, and the terrible pride that can tear that same life apart over a single insult. The Howards weren't monsters. They were men, trapped in a cage built by poverty, ignorance, and trauma. Each generation inherited the pain of the last, and the only tool they were ever given to deal with that pain was rage. Silas Howard didn't learn his violence from a demon in a mine. He learned it in the silence of a father who never showed him love, and in the screams of a mother he couldn't protect. The names on the headstones have faded, and the cabins have crumbled back into the earth, but the lesson of Moan Hollow remains, a quiet warning carried on the mountain breeze. It teaches us that the most terrible ghosts are the ones we create ourselves, the ones that live inside our own families. The story of the Howards is a bitter parable about how a man can escape a war, can escape a hollow, but can never truly escape the legacy of his father's hands. And now, my friends, you know the story of Moan Hollow. And you know why the old folks say, even on a still day, the wind in that valley still sounds a little like weeping. Out here, deep in a West Virginia holler, where the road turns to gravel and the fog clings to the hillsides, the modern world gets quiet. You can find places like this all over the mountains. A forgotten family cemetery, nearly swallowed by ivy and time. These aren't grand monuments. They're simple weathered stones, leaning like old men tired of telling the same story. But it's the names and the dates etched upon them that pull you in. Earl Gibson died 1921. Silas Blackwood died 1923. These men didn't die in the mines. They didn't fall to the fever that swept through these camps so often. They shared one thing, and one thing only. A wife. A woman named Zoe Wilkins. To the law that condemned her, she was a monster. To her few defenders, she was just the unluckiest woman in the state. But to everyone else, she had a different name. The Black Widow of Appalachia. Today, we stand among these silent stones to listen to their whispers and piece together a story this land has tried its best to forget. Let's wind the clock back 100 years. The air here wasn't clean and silent then. It was thick with the grit of coal dust, a fine black powder that settled on windowsills, in your lungs, and in the lines of every face. This hollow was alive with the rumble of coal cars on the tracks and the distant rhythmic clang of pickaxes against the mountain's bones. Life was dictated by the shriek of the company whistle, a sound that sent men like Earl Gibson into the dark belly of the earth before sunrise, and a sound that wives like Zeo Zoe prayed to hear again at the end of the day. Earl was a young man, strong and full of the quiet hope that marks so many who work a dangerous trade. He believed his back was broad enough to carve out a decent life for him and his new wife. He'd come home each evening, his face caked in black, and wash up in a basin on the porch of their small two-room cabin. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a tiny speck of warmth against the vast, indifferent mountains. Zeo Zoe was different from the other miners' wives. While they gathered on their porches to trade gossip and remedies, she often kept to herself. She wasn't unfriendly, just reserved. She had a sharp mind and a gaze that seemed to take in everything, a calm that felt out of place in a world built on noise and struggle. Some saw it as dignity. Others, even then, whispered it was a kind of coldness, an ambition that didn't belong in a simple coal camp. Their life together was a routine of small things, a shared meal of beans and cornbread by the fire, Earl talking about his dream of one day saving enough to buy a small piece of land away from the company store and its endless cycle of debt. Zeo Zoe would listen, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, her thoughts her own. To anyone looking in, they were just another young couple trying to survive in a place that didn't make survival easy. But in these mountains, death was a constant neighbor. It came suddenly in the form of a rockfall or a gas explosion in the mine. It came slowly in the wheezing cough of black lung. And it came violently in the gut-wrenching sickness they called the flux, a plague that could sweep through a camp and fill a graveyard in a matter of weeks. A doctor was a luxury, and a sudden death was a tragedy, but it was a familiar one. It was a world that had grown used to the sight of fresh-dug graves, a fact that would soon prove very convenient for someone. The stories buried in the ground are one thing. The stories buried in paper and ink are another. In a county courthouse basement, tucked away in a dusty archive box, you can find the documents that give a voice to those silent gravestones. It's amazing what survives. This here is a copy of a page from the local paper, dated 1921. It's brittle and yellow, the words printed in the stark, formal language of the time. It's a short column nestled between an advertisement for livestock feed and a notice about a church social. It's the obituary for Earl Gibson. It's barely a paragraph long, and it reads just like 100 others from that era. It says he was a fine, hard-working man, taken too soon by a sudden and severe gastric illness, a stomach flux. The kind of thing that could kill a man in 3 days and have the neighbors nodding in sympathy, murmuring about bad water or tainted food. On the surface, it's just another sad, common story. A young wife left all alone. The community pitied her. But it's another piece of paper from that same box that changes the tone completely. This one is a life insurance claim, filed by Zeo Zoe Gibson, just days after her husband was in the ground. It wasn't a huge amount of money, not by today's standards. But in 1921, to a miner's widow with no other prospects, it was a small fortune. It was enough to buy a little plot of land, enough to be free from the company store, enough to breathe for the first time in her life without the weight of debt and dependency. This document right here, this isn't just an insurance policy, it's the first clue. It raises the question that no one dared to ask out loud back then. Was this just a fortunate coincidence in the midst of tragedy? Or was this the moment Zeo Zoe Wilkins realized that a husband's life had a value, but his death had a price? That insurance money from Earl's death changed things, not in a loud way, but in a way the whole hollow could feel. Zeo Zoe didn't pack up and leave. She didn't waste the money on frivolous things. She bought a small plot of land, a little house just outside the direct control of the mining company. For the first time, she was a woman who owned something, a woman who answered to no one. And you have to understand, in a place where the company owned the houses, the store, and a man's very soul until his debt was paid, that kind of independence was as strange and unsettling as a summer snow. At first, the whispers were sympathetic. Good for her, some would say, making the best of a bad situation. But pity in a small town has a short shelf life, especially when the object of that pity seems to be doing just fine. Zoe's grief didn't look like the grief they were used to. It wasn't loud and public. It was a quiet, private thing. She held her head high. She managed her own affairs. And soon, the whispers began to change their tune. She didn't grieve long. They'd murmur over a fence post. Seems that money dried her tears right up. It was then that Silas Blackwood entered the picture. Silas was a mine foreman, older than Zoe, a man with a bit of authority, and more importantly, a healthy savings account. He was a widower himself, known to enjoy his drink, a man whose loneliness was as plain to see as the coal dust on his boots. He saw in Zoe a beautiful, quiet woman, a fine wife to run his home and ease his later years. He was flattered by her attention. And Zoe, well, she saw something in him too. She saw security. She saw a bigger house, more money, another step up and away from the life she was born into. That first insurance policy had been a revelation. It had shown her a way out of the grime and the poverty, a path paved not with a lifetime of backbreaking labor, but with a simple signature on a piece of paper and a well-timed tragedy. Her courtship with Silas Blackwood wasn't a romance. It was a business transaction, and the whole community was watching. They saw the older man, charmed and foolish. They saw the young widow, her eyes not on the man, but on what the man had. The seeds of conflict weren't just being sown in that little house. They were being planted in the minds of every neighbor who watched her, every gossip at the company store. They were just waiting for a reason for their suspicions to take root, and Zoe was about to give them one. History isn't just found in archives. Sometimes it's sitting on a front porch in a rocking chair, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Down a winding road, I found Elmore Vance. He's an old man now, with hands as gnarled as oak roots and eyes that have seen nearly a century of these mountains. He is the great-nephew of Silas Blackwood, and his grandfather was the man who first tried to sound the alarm. For his family, the story of Zoe Wilkins isn't a folk tale. It's a wound that has never fully healed. He doesn't call her the Black Widow. In the Vance family, she has always been that Wilkins woman. He speaks in a slow, deliberate cadence, the way men do when they're recalling a story they've heard 1,000 times, a story that's become a part of their own blood. My granddaddy, Jasper, he begins, he liked Silas, but he never trusted her, not for a minute. He said she had still eyes, like a snake on a rock, watching but never blinking. According to the story passed down to Elmore, the trouble came to a head just 6 months after the wedding. Silas, puffed up with pride and eager to show what a good provider he was, told his brother Jasper that he'd taken out a brand new, sizable life insurance policy. "Just to make sure my Zio is looked after if anything happens to me," he'd said with a grin. Elmore leans forward in his chair. Granddaddy said when he heard those words, a cold spot formed right in his gut. It was the same story, all over again. Jasper went to Silas that very evening and begged him to see reason. He didn't accuse Zoe directly, not at first. He just pleaded with his brother's common sense. "A woman who profits from one husband's grave is just unlucky," Elmore recounts his granddaddy saying. "But a woman who stands to profit from a second, that ain't luck, Silas. That's a plan." But Silas was blinded by his new bride. He got angry, accused his brother of jealousy, and told him to get out of his house and mind his own business. That argument, on the porch of a cabin that no longer stands, was more than just a family squabble. It was a line drawn in the dirt. Jasper Vance had made himself a problem. He had spoken the suspicion that everyone else was only whispering, and in doing so, He had put himself directly in the path of that Wilkins woman. The point of no return had been crossed, not just for Silas, but for his brother too. The argument didn't happen in whispers. It was a confrontation, born of desperation. Following his grim conversation with Silas, Jasper Vance couldn't let it rest. He walked over to his brother's cabin that very evening. The lamp was lit inside, casting a warm, deceptive glow. Zoe herself sat in a rocking chair by the hearth, darning one of Silas' work socks. She moved with a quiet efficiency, a picture of domestic peace. Jasper stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Silas," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to talk. That new insurance policy, it don't sit right with me." Silas, who had been enjoying the quiet evening, stiffened. He looked from his brother's worried face to his wife, who hadn't even looked up from her sewing. "Now, Jasper, we've been over this." "No, we ain't," Jasper insisted, stepping inside. "Earl Gibson took sick not long after she insured him. Now you do the same, and for twice the money. You're a fool if you don't see the pattern." The accusation hung in the small room, thick and ugly. Zoe's needle stopped its steady rhythm. For a single charged moment, the cabin was utterly silent. Silas's face flushed with anger. It was one thing for the town to whisper, but for his own brother to say it, in his own home, in front of his wife, it was an unbearable insult. "You'll not come into my house and call my wife a ghoul," he roared, getting to his feet. "She's a good woman. She's nursed me when I was sick. She's kept this house better than anyone. You're just jealous." "Jealous of what, Silas?" "Your own funeral?" Jasper shot back. "That was the final straw." "Get out," Silas snarled, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "Get out of my home, and don't you come back till you're ready to apologize to her." Jasper looked at his brother, his face a mask of sorrow and frustration. Then his eyes met Zoe's across the room. For the first time, she looked directly at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no fear. There was nothing at all. It was a calm, calculating stillness, the look of a woman who had just identified a problem and was already working on the solution. As Jasper backed out into the cold night air, he knew he hadn't just lost a brother. He had made a mortal enemy. The cabin door closed, shutting out not just a brother, but Silas Blackwood's last chance at salvation. You have to push your way through a thicket of rhododendron and climb over a fallen oak to find it now. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd walk right past it. But it's here. A collapsed square of foundation stones covered in a thick carpet of moss, and in the center, a jumbled pile of rock and soot-stained clay. This is all that's left of the chimney, once the warm, beating heart of the home where Silas Blackwood lived with his new wife. This isn't a place marked by the scars of a single violent act. There are no bullet holes in these stones. The horror that unfolded here was quiet, patient, and domestic. It was hidden in the everyday. Over there, nearly choked with a century of dead leaves, is the stone-lined well. This is where Zoe would have drawn the water for Silas' morning coffee, for the soup she simmered on the stove, for the cool drink he'd ask for when the first feverish thirst began to burn in his throat. Right here. This is where it happened. Not with the roar of a gunshot, but with the scrape of a spoon against the bottom of a bowl. The act of murder wasn't a moment of rage. It was a daily chore, a patient administering of poison disguised as an act of love. Within these stone foundations, Silas Blackwood wasted away, believing he was being cared for by a devoted wife, never realizing that the hands that soothed his brow were the same hands that were slowly, methodically killing him. The air is still and peaceful now, but this ground remembers the silence that followed the arguments and the terrible sickness that began soon after. It began, as Jasper Vance had feared, just a few weeks after their argument. Silas Blackwood started complaining of a fire in his belly. At first, he dismissed it as a bad batch of moonshine, a common ailment for him. Zoe was the very picture of a concerned wife. She brewed him herbal teas and insisted he stay home from the mines to rest. But the rest didn't help. The fire in his gut turned into a vice, twisting and cramping until the strong foreman was doubled over in his chair. Then came the sickness, a violent, unending wave of it that left him weak and trembling. He craved water, a burning, desperate thirst that no amount of liquid could quench. And through it all, Zoe was a constant presence. She was always there with a cool cloth for his forehead and a bowl of thin broth. "Just a little something to keep your strength up," she would murmur, spooning the warm liquid into his mouth. To any neighbor who stopped by to check on the ailing man, she was a saint. They saw her tending to him day and night, her face etched with worry. They didn't see the tiny pinch of white powder she stirred into the soup when no one was looking. The days bled into weeks. Silas, once a stout and hearty man, began to shrink. His skin grew pale and loose, his eyes sunk deep into their sockets. He became a ghost in his own home, too weak to leave his bed. The company doctor came once, a rushed visit between a broken leg at the mine and a birthing up the creek. He took one look at the withered man in the bed, listened to Zoe's calm description of the symptoms, and nodded grimly. "It's the stomach flux, and a bad case of it," he declared. "Keep him comfortable. That's all you can do." One evening, after Silas had been bedridden for nearly a month, his brother Jasper came to the house again, swallowing his pride. He couldn't bear the thought of his brother dying without making peace. He found Silas barely conscious, his breathing shallow. Zoe sat by the bed, her hands folded in her lap. Jasper looked at the shell of his brother, then at her calm, serene face, and the awful truth settled in his heart like a stone. He left without a word, the image of that quiet, patient woman seared into his memory. The rocking chair in the corner of the room swayed gently in the draught from the door, empty, but for the shawl left draped over its back. Silas Blackwood's struggle ended 2 nights later, in the dark, silent heart of the Appalachian night. After a man dies, his story is told in whispers. But the version that lasts, the one that gets filed away, is told in ink. This is the death certificate for Silas Blackwood, filed in the county clerk's office. It's a simple bureaucratic ledger. Name, date of birth, date of death. And under the heading Cause of Death, the doctor wrote 2 words, acute gastritis. It's so clean, so medical. A neat and tidy explanation that fits perfectly in a little box on a form. But acute gastritis doesn't capture the truth of it. It doesn't describe a man wasting away for weeks, his body racked with a fire that no water could put out. It doesn't mention the insurance policy that had just been signed, or the brother who was shouting warnings that nobody listened to. The official record sanitizes the horror, boiling a slow, agonizing death down to a stomach ache. But then, you find another file. This one isn't from the doctor, it's from the insurance company. And insurance men, they have a different kind of curiosity. They deal in patterns and probabilities. The report, written by a claims investigator, is just as dry, but it asks a pointed question. He notes, "This is the second claim filed by Mrs. Wilkins in 3 years, both following the sudden gastric death of a husband. Further inquiry is recommended." Those 2 words, further inquiry, were the spark that lit the fuse. That recommendation led to this, the exhumation order from the circuit court judge. Look at the formal, looping script. It gives law enforcement the authority to go to the quiet churchyard cemetery and disturb a fresh grave. This piece of paper took the whispers of the holler and turned them into the cold, hard action of the law. The official record started with a lie, but it ended with an order to dig up the truth. That exhumation order was not a quiet affair. The news spread through the hollers like a brush fire. On the day the sheriff and his deputies arrived at the cemetery with shovels, a crowd gathered at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and dread. The sound of digging was the only noise that broke the silence. When the caskets of both Earl Gibson and Silas Blackwood were opened, a collective gasp went through the onlookers. The bodies were in an unnervingly well-preserved state, a telltale sign of the preserving qualities of arsenic. The whispers now had physical proof. The truth wasn't just buried 6 feet deep, it was pickled in poison. The day the law came for Zeo Zoe Wilkins, there was no dramatic chase through the mountains. Sheriff Miller and a deputy simply rode their horses up to her little house. She was on the porch, rocking in her chair, as if she were expecting them. They say she didn't flinch when the sheriff showed her the warrant for her arrest. She didn't cry or protest her innocence. She simply stood up, smoothed the front of her black dress, went inside to fetch her bonnet, and walked with them as calmly as if she were heading to the Sunday service. Her silence was more damning than any confession. The trial was a mountain spectacle. The courthouse was packed to the rafters every single day, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and cheap tobacco. Miners took days off from the coalface. Farmers left their fields, all to cram into the sweltering room and get a look at the woman they were now calling the Mountain Borgia. It wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. This was the community's chance to finally pass judgment on the woman who had unsettled them for so long. The prosecutor, a fire and brimstone preacher in a lawyer's suit, built his case brick by damning brick. He laid out the pattern of death and the pattern of profit, showing the jury how each untimely death had made Zeo Zoe a richer woman. His star witness was the town pharmacist, a nervous little man named Abernathy, who, under oath, pointed a trembling finger directly at the defendant. "That's her," he squeaked. "She's the one who kept buying rough-on-rats poison, said she had a terrible infestation, bought enough to kill every rat in the county." Her defense lawyer fought back, painting a picture of a poor, misunderstood widow being persecuted by superstitious neighbors. He argued that dysentery was common, that arsenic was used in every farmhouse, that this was nothing more than a witch hunt fueled by gossip and jealousy. But his arguments were undone by his own client. Zeo Zoe sat through the entire proceeding as still as a stone effigy. When the prosecutor finally turned to her and thundered, "Did you feed these men poison for their insurance money, Mrs. Wilkins?" She looked at him with those unblinking eyes and said, in a voice no louder than a rustling leaf, "No, sir, I did not." She showed no fear, no anger, no grief, nothing. That chilling calm was all the jury needed to see. They were out for less than 2 hours. When they filed back in, their faces were set like stone. The foreman didn't even look at her as he delivered the verdict. Guilty. The judge, his voice ringing with condemnation, called her actions a cold-blooded stain upon the soul of this state and sentenced her to spend the rest of her natural life in the state penitentiary. The law's pursuit was over. The official record was now written, and Zeo Zoe Wilkins's name was forever etched into the annals of Appalachian crime. We're back where we started, in this quiet little cemetery tucked into the side of the mountain. Here are the stones for Earl Gibson and Silas Blackwood. They're weathered, but you can see that someone still tends to them. The weeds are pulled back, and a small faded plastic flower sits in the dirt in front of Silas's marker. Their names are still here, etched in stone, a permanent testament to the lives they lived, however short. They remain a part of this land, buried in the soil they called home, remembered by family. But to find Zeo Zoe Wilkins's final resting place, you have to travel hundreds of miles away, to the grounds of the old state penitentiary. There's a field there, behind the high stone walls. It's not a family plot. It's a place of grim uniformity, a grid of simple, numbered markers for the inmates who lived and died in the state's care. There are no loving epitaphs, no flowers, no family names. It's a place scrubbed clean of personal history. And under one of those anonymous markers lies the woman who caused so much turmoil. There is the final biting irony of her story. The woman who craved land, money, and independence, who killed to possess the property of other men, ended her days with nothing to her name. Her final home is a numbered plot of earth owned by the very state that locked her away. Her victims, the poor miners she looked down on, lie here in the free mountain air, their names known. Her name, the one that once struck fear into a whole community, is nowhere to be found. Looking at these disparate graves, the remembered and the forgotten, you realize the verdict wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the final chapter. For the families left behind, and for Zeo Zoe herself, the sentence was the start of a long, slow aftermath, a shadow that would stretch on for decades. After the gavel fell and the cell door clanged shut, a different kind of quiet settled over the holler. The excitement of the trial bled away, leaving behind the awkward silence of a community that had just consumed one of its own. For a time, life tried to return to normal. The company whistle blew, the men went back into the mines, and the women went back to their chores. But a scar had been left. Doors were locked a little tighter at night, and a neighbor's sudden sickness was met with a flicker of suspicion that hadn't been there before. For Jasper Vance, the verdict was not a victory. The justice he had fought so hard for tasted like ash in his mouth. It didn't bring his brother back. It didn't erase the memory of Silas wasting away in that bed, or the image of Zeo Zoe's cold, placid face in the courtroom. He had been right, but being right had brought him no peace. He lived out his years a quieter, more somber man, forever marked by the knowledge of what one human being was capable of doing to another, hidden behind a placid smile and a bowl of soup. Meanwhile, Zeo Zoe Wilkins traded the green, open mountains for a world of grey stone and iron bars. Her reputation preceded her, and the other inmates at the penitentiary gave her a wide berth. They watched the infamous Black Widow, expecting to see a monster. Instead, they saw a quiet, reserved woman who did her work in the prison laundry without complaint, who read books from the meager library, and who never, ever spoke of her past. Her chilling composure, which had condemned her in court, now served as a kind of armor. She was an enigma within the walls, just as she had been in the hollow. The years ground on, turning the ink on the court records from black to brown. Zeo Zoe's dark hair turned to grey. Her youth and beauty faded under the harsh prison lights, but her story didn't. She never filed an appeal. She never sought a pardon. And to the parole boards that met with her every few years, she gave the same calm, unwavering answer she gave in the courtroom. I did not do it. Her silence became her final legacy, a wall of denial that would stand until the day she died, an old woman in a prison infirmary, taking her secrets, whatever they were, with her to a numbered grave. You'd think a guilty verdict and a life sentence would be the end of it. The case closed, the story finished. But in the mountains, stories have a way of living on, of changing shape in the telling. And the story of Zeo Zoe Wilkins is no exception. To this day, the truth of what happened in that little cabin remains a point of contention, a ghost that haunts the family lines. For the descendants of the Vance family, and for most people who know the tale, the book is closed. Zeo Zoe Wilkins was a monster hiding in plain sight, a mountain Medea who saw her husbands not as partners, but as assets to be liquidated. They point to the pattern, the insurance money, the pharmacist's testimony, and her chilling lack of emotion in the courtroom. To them, it's an open and shut case, a clear story of greed dressed in a black mourning gown. But Zeo Zoe never confessed. And that single stubborn fact, her lifelong insistence on her own innocence, has been just enough to keep a flicker of doubt alive for 100 years. You can still find a few old-timers, a few contrarians, who will offer up the other side. They'll ask you, was she a killer, or was she just a woman who refused to play the part of the helpless, weeping widow? In an age when women were expected to be emotional and dependent, Zeo Zoe was quiet, intelligent, and handled her own finances. Was she condemned for murder, or was she condemned for being different? They'll point out that the evidence was purely circumstantial. No one ever saw her put poison in the soup. They saw a woman buy rat poison, a common household item, and they saw men die of a common stomach ailment, and they drew a straight, deadly line between the two. Perhaps, they argue, she was just the victim of a mountain witch hunt, a woman destroyed by gossip and the bad luck of being widowed twice. The truth? The absolute truth of what was in her heart probably died with her in that prison infirmary. All we're left with are the conflicting echoes, two stories that can't both be true, but that both refuse to die. Over the decades, the hard facts of the Zio Zoe Wilkins trial began to soften and warp like old glass in a fire. Her story leached out of the courthouse records and seeped into the soil of the mountains themselves, where it grew into something else entirely, a full-blown Appalachian legend. The flesh-and-blood woman who bought rat poison at the general store was slowly replaced by a supernatural phantom, a creature of folklore. For generations, her name became a cautionary tale. Mothers would warn their sons, "You be careful of a pretty face with a quiet tongue. Remember Zio Zoe." She became the local boogeyman, a dark fable about the poison of greed. They stopped talking about arsenic and started whispering about a secret spring deep in the woods whose water was tainted by the devil himself, water she would collect in a blue glass bottle under a new moon. They swore that the roses she planted on her husband's graves always bloomed with withered black petals, as if the very ground rejected her feigned grief. And of course, there is the ghost story. Some say that on a moonless night, if you stand by the fallen chimney where her house once stood, you can sometimes see a faint light moving through the trees. They say it's the ghost of Zio Zoe, forever wandering the land she bought with blood, eternally searching for something she can never truly own. The real woman died in a state prison far from here. But the legend, the dark and terrifying story the mountains created to explain a horror they couldn't comprehend, that story never left. And so we find ourselves back where we began, standing in this quiet patch of ground among the leaning stones. It looks the same. The ivy still crawls over the fence line, and the wind still sighs through the pines. But it feels different now, doesn't it? These aren't just names on weathered rock anymore. They are Earl and Silas, men with hopes and fears, whose lives ended in a bowl of soup. We see the ghost of a small cabin over on that ridge, and we can almost feel the cold, calculating gaze of the woman who watched the world from its porch. We have followed this story from these graves to the dusty pages of the courthouse, from the faded memory of an old man on his porch to the grim reality of a prison ledger. We've seen how a real-life tragedy, born of desperation and greed, can curdle into a ghost story told to frighten children. It's a reminder that every forgotten foundation, every overgrown family plot you pass on a lonely road isn't just a ruin. It's a library, filled with stories of love, rage, and the terrible choices that can echo for a century. Was Zio Zoe Wilkins a cold-blooded monster or a misunderstood woman condemned by circumstance? The absolute truth of what was in her heart is likely buried with her in that anonymous grave. But in the end, it almost doesn't matter. The story she created, whether by her actions or by her silence, has become a part of this landscape, as permanent as the mountains themselves. The arsenic has long since turned to dust. The insurance money is gone. The people are all just memories, but the story remains. They say that on May 5, 1931, the mountains of Harlan County themselves held their breath. Down below, a convoy of cars carrying company men and the law's hired guns slowed to a crawl. And from the hillsides, an answer came not in words, but in a roar of gunfire that tore the morning apart. This was the moment that would forever define a place known as Bloody Harlan. Was it a murderous ambush, as the coal barons screamed to the world? Or was it the last desperate act of men who had been beaten, starved, and cornered? The truth, as it always does in those dark hollows, is buried deep. Today, we're not just going to talk about a gunfight. We're going to uncover the story of the pressure, the pain, and the poverty that led to the Battle of Evarts, a day when ordinary miners decided they would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. To understand the men who took to the hills with rifles that day, you first have to understand the world that made them. Harlan County in the early 1900s wasn't a place of opportunity. It was a kingdom of coal, and every man, woman, and child was a subject. A boy was born in a house the company owned, breathing in the black dust that settled on his cradle. He played in the shadow of the tipple that would one day claim his father, and knew, with a certainty that chilled the bone, that it would one day claim him too. This wasn't just a job. It was a system of total control. You lived in the company's house, so you could be evicted at a moment's notice. You shopped at the company's store, where your dollar was worth 50 cents, and you were paid not in American money, but in company scrip. This private currency was a leash designed to keep you in a state of permanent debt. A man could spend his entire life deep in the earth, risking his life for a pittance, and still die owing the company money. His debt would then pass to his sons. It was a new kind of feudalism, hidden away in the American mountains. The land itself taught them to be hard. The mountains demanded self-reliance. A man learned to hunt, to fix what was broken, and to stand his ground because no one else was coming to help him. This forged a powerful code, an unspoken law that was older and deeper than any statute passed in a distant capital. You stood by your kin. You looked a man in the eye. You did not suffer an insult to your honor, and you never, ever let an outsider push you off your own ground. The mine was a brutal teacher. Every day was a gamble against a cave-in, a gas explosion, or the slow, suffocating death of black lung. Men watched their friends get crushed, their fathers waste away, their brothers carried out on a stretcher. They learned that their lives were cheap, just another cost on the company's ledger. This constant dance with death bred a certain kind of fatalism, but it also bred a deep, simmering rage. So when the Great Depression hit, and the operators demanded that these men work for even less, they weren't just cutting a wage. They were breaking a sacred, unspoken pact. The miners had endured the danger, the debt, and the dust. They had traded their health and their freedom for a life that was just barely livable. By trying to take that last crumb, the company wasn't just making a business decision. They were delivering the final, unforgivable insult to the mountain code. They were pushing men who had nothing left to lose. Before the strike, before the guns, there was a life. It was a hard life, to be sure, but it was theirs. A miner's day began in darkness and ended in darkness, but in between there were moments of light. A man's kingdom wasn't the mine, and it wasn't the company town. It was the few square feet of his front porch where he'd sit at the end of a shift, bone-tired, and watch his children play in the yard. It was the smell of supper cooking, the one time of day the scent of coal was overpowered by something that felt like home. These men weren't just workers, they were husbands and fathers. They held a deep, fierce pride in their ability to provide, to put food on the table, no matter how meager. They'd come home with their faces permanently stained with black dust, but they would wash their hands clean before holding their babies. Their world was one of small dignities, a well-tended garden, a hymn sung in church on Sunday morning, the quiet respect of their neighbors. This was the life they were defending. It wasn't about a theory of labor. It was about their kids having shoes in the winter. And there was a brotherhood forged in the belly of the earth. Down in the darkness, a man's life depended entirely on the man next to him. They learned to read the groans of the mountain, to listen for the shifting of rock, to trust each other's instincts without a word. This created a bond that outsiders could never understand. They were more than neighbors. They were soldiers in a daily war against the mountain. They shared their last chew of tobacco, covered for each other when the foreman was on the prowl, and mourned together when the mountain inevitably claimed one of their own. This was the world the coal operators failed to see. They saw numbers on a ledger, a list of employees, a cost to be managed. They did not see the tight-knit fabric of a community woven from shared hardship and fierce loyalty. They didn't understand that when you threatened one family, you threatened them all. The world they had built, This fragile ecosystem of kinship and honor was the only thing they had. And when the company came for it, they were coming for everything. The same mountain that gives a man his strength also carves his deepest flaw. For the miners of Harlan County, that flaw was a pride as hard and sharp as a shard of slate. It was a pride born of survival, a refusal to bow your head to any man, be he a foreman or a king. This wasn't arrogance. It was a deep-seated belief that a man's dignity was the one thing the company couldn't own and the mountain couldn't crush. There were stories told in the camps that every miner understood. A story of a man who put down his tools and walked out of the mine, sacrificing his job and his family's next meal, all because a young foreman from up north had called him boy. He wasn't being defiant for the sake of it. He was upholding a code. To accept the insult would be to admit that the company owned his spirit as well as his labor, and that was a line he would not cross. He lost his job, his home, and was blacklisted from every mine in the county, but he kept his honor intact. This unwavering pride was a kind of psychological armor against the crushing darkness of the mines. It's what allowed a man to walk into the earth each morning with his head held high. But it was also a fatal vulnerability. The operators, in their distant offices, may not have understood the men, but their enforcers on the ground, the gun thugs and the sheriffs, they understood this pride perfectly. They learned it was a button they could push. They knew that these were not men who could be shamed or intimidated into submission indefinitely. They were men who would bend and bend and bend, absorbing every hardship with a stoic silence. But when you pushed them past that breaking point, when you made it a question of their honor as men, they would not break. They would explode. This pride, this absolute refusal to be seen as less than a man, was the powder keg sitting in the heart of Harlan County. All it needed was a spark. The first affront was the wage cut, a cold dismissal of their worth. The next was the company's response to the union. Any man who joined was fired, his name put on a blacklist that was a death sentence to his career. But the deepest cut, the one that went past the wallet and into the soul, was the evictions. Miners and their families, with nowhere to go, were thrown out of their company shacks, their belongings piled in the muddy road. It was an act of calculated cruelty, designed not just to punish the men, but to break their wives and starve their children. The pressure built until the air in Harlan felt thick enough to ignite. And on the morning of May the 5th, 1931, the company provided the spark. They decided to make a statement. They assembled a convoy of 3 cars, filled not just with non-union workers, but with the most hated symbols of their power, company officials and Sheriff J.H. Blair's deputies, the gun thugs who had been beating and intimidating them for weeks. Their goal was to parade these scabs right through the town of Evarts. This was not a logistical move. This was a deliberate act of humiliation. It was a victory lap for the company, a public declaration that the strike was broken, that the men were beaten, and that the company's power was absolute. To the striking miners, watching from the hillsides where many of their families were now living in makeshift tents, this was an invasion. It was the enemy marching through their territory, flying a flag of contempt. The news passed from holler to holler, not in a shout, but in a low, dangerous whisper. They're coming. That was all that needed to be said. Men looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. This was no longer about a contract. This was about honor. It was a direct challenge to their pride, a public taunt. To stand by and watch that convoy roll through town would be to admit defeat. It would be to accept the role of the beaten dog, to bow your head and concede that you were less than a man. And for these men, forged by the mountain's harsh code, that was an impossibility. The moment that convoy was formed, the choice was made for them. Their pride, the very core of their identity, demanded a response. And in Harlan County, a response like that only came from the barrel of a gun. There were voices of reason, you see. There always are. Union organizers, men sent down from the national office, understood the danger. They knew that an open gunfight would bring the full weight of the state down on them. It would give the operators the perfect excuse to call in the National Guard and crush the strike with bayonets and machine guns. Their strategy was one of patience, of holding the line, of winning the war of public opinion. They preached discipline, warning the men not to be provoked, not to give the company the violence it so clearly wanted. But for a man watching his child grow thin, the word patience is a curse. For a man who has been beaten by company thugs and seen his furniture thrown into the street, the idea of discipline sounds like cowardice. The organizers' warnings, however wise, were spoken in a language these miners no longer understood. The company had been communicating in the language of brute force for months. The miners were simply deciding to answer in kind. Their pride, that raw, unshakable mountain pride, could not absorb another blow. The decision wasn't made in a meeting or put to a vote. It was made in silence, in the grim set of 100 jaws. It was the quiet click of a rifle bolt in a dozen hillside tents. It was a man giving his wife a look that said everything before taking his old shotgun down from the wall. One by one, then in small groups, they began to move. They slipped away from the desperate little camps and filtered down through the woods, their movements quiet and purposeful. This wasn't a mob, it was an army assembling. They knew the convoy's route, they knew the land better than any deputy, and they knew the perfect spot, a place where the road narrowed and was forced to cross the railroad tracks at the edge of Evarts. It was a natural choke point, a place where the cars would have to slow to a crawl. They took up positions on the wooded hillside overlooking the road, some behind trees, others in the shallow ditches. They were no longer just striking miners, they were choosing a battlefield. Every man who took his place on that hillside was consciously rejecting a path of peace. He was ignoring the warnings of the organizers. He was turning his back on the slim hope of a negotiated settlement. He was betting his life and the future of his family on the outcome of the next few minutes. The company had offered them a choice: submission or starvation. On that morning, the miners of Harlan County chose a third option: war. The path had narrowed until there was only one way forward, and it was lined with guns. There was a moment just before the first engine was heard when the world went still. The men lay hidden on the hillside, the cool earth pressed against them, the weight of their rifles familiar in their hands. The sun was climbing, casting long shadows through the trees. A bird sang somewhere nearby, oblivious. In that sliver of time, there was a profound silence. And that silence was the final off-ramp. It was the last chance for any man to back away, to slip back through the trees and return to his family. In that quiet, what does a man think about? He doesn't think about labor law or economic theory. He thinks about the look on his wife's face that morning. He thinks about his daughter's worn-out shoes. He remembers the cold knot of shame in his stomach when he had to tell his family there was no food. Then, another set of images floods his mind. The sneering face of a deputy, the sight of a neighbor's furniture sitting in the rain, the memory of a beating behind the company store. This was the final crossroads, not an offer from the company, but a question each man had to ask himself. He weighed the two futures. One was a future of slow, grinding surrender, a life of accepting insults, of watching his family suffer, of dying a little inside each day. The other future was unknown, violent, and terrifying, but it was a future where he stood up. He wasn't choosing between peace and violence. He was choosing between two kinds of death: the death of the spirit, or the risk of the death of the body. And then they heard it. A low, distant rumble. The sound grew, becoming the unmistakable growl of automobile engines. That sound shattered the silence and ended the debate. It was the sound of the enemy, confident and arrogant, coming to rub their noses in defeat. Every doubt, every fear, every hesitation was burned away by that approaching sound. It was the final provocation. Along the hillside, you could feel the change. A man would shift his weight, settling the rifle stock more firmly against his shoulder. A thumb would quietly pull back a hammer, the soft metallic click barely audible. Eyes narrowed, focusing on the bend in the road. The final crossroads had been passed. The choice was made. The silence of peace was over, and the sound of the reckoning was on its way. The three black cars came around the bend, slow and arrogant. They looked alien against the green hills, like beetles crawling across a leaf. To the men watching from above, they weren't just vehicles. They were steel-skinned symbols of a power that had crushed them for a generation. As the convoy slowed for the railroad tracks, the air grew so tight it felt like the whole world was a clenched fist waiting to strike. Who fired first? The company swore it was an ambush, a cowardly volley from the trees. The miners swore a deputy in the lead car leveled his pistol, and a single sharp crack broke the morning peace. The truth was lost in the first echo, because that one shot was answered by a deafening chorus from the hillside. The argument that had raged for months in company offices and desperate tent camps was suddenly, permanently over. The time for talking was done. The world dissolved into noise. It wasn't the clean sound of a single shot, but a chaotic rolling thunder that battered the eardrums and shook the leaves from the trees. It was the roar of old hunting rifles, the heavy boom of shotguns, and the crack of pistols, all woven together into a single terrifying sound. The air filled with the sharp, bitter smell of gunpowder. Splinters of wood flew from the trees, and pockmarks appeared on the steel bodies of the cars as if from an invisible hailstorm. For each miner on that hillside, the world narrowed to a single point. It was the face of a man in a car, a man who represented the beatings, the evictions, the hunger. The kick of the rifle against a shoulder was a physical release of a year's worth of stored-up rage and helplessness. There was no strategy, no battle plan. There was only a raw, primal instinct to fight back, to finally answer force with force. Inside the cars, it was a trap. The world became a terrifying drumbeat of impacts against the metal frame. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. One of the hated company guards in the lead car suddenly slumped forward without a sound. In another car, a company official cried out and went down. The illusion of their power, the authority that came from their guns and their money, was being shredded one bullet at a time. Then, almost as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The roaring faded into a few last, sporadic shots that echoed away into the mountains. A heavy, ringing silence rushed in to fill the void. Blue-gray smoke drifted through the trees, slowly clearing like a rising curtain. In the stillness, nothing moved. The birds were silent. The engines of the cars had stalled. A profound and terrible stillness had fallen over the choke point at the edge of Evarts. The battle had lasted only a few minutes, but it had changed everything. When the final tally was made, 4 men lay dead or dying on that dusty stretch of road. One of them was a miner, Jim Penland, who instantly became a martyr. The other 3 were from the company side. The convoy, shattered and bleeding, turned and fled in chaos, leaving their dead behind. The miners had held the ground. They had won the battle. For a long moment after the last car had vanished in a cloud of dust, nobody moved. The miners remained frozen on the hillside, phantom figures in the lingering gunpowder smoke. The only sound was the frantic ringing in their own ears. There was no cheering, no shouts of victory. There was only a cold, stark realization of what had been done. Below them, on the road, lay the undeniable proof. The still bodies, the abandoned cars riddled with holes. They had faced the monster, and for the first time they hadn't flinched. They had fired back, and they had won. But that feeling of grim triumph was fleeting, quickly replaced by a chilling clarity. They were no longer just striking miners fighting for a wage. In the eyes of the law, the company's law, they were now murderers. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. They knew what was coming next. The sheriff would raise a posse of every gun thug in the county. The governor would be called. The full, crushing weight of the state would descend upon these hollers with a singular purpose: to hunt them down. And just like that, the spell was broken. A low voice cut through the silence. "Scatter!" It was all that was needed. The men didn't run in a panic, they simply faded back into the trees. They melted into the landscape that had birthed them, disappearing up hidden paths and secret ridgelines that no outsider could ever hope to find. They moved with the quiet certainty of men on their own ground, their retreat as disciplined and purposeful as their attack had been. They were now fugitives. The men who had stood as a defiant army just minutes before were now solitary shadows, making their way to hidden cabins and sympathetic farmhouses deep in the mountains. They would be hunted, but here, in the labyrinth of hills and hollows they called home, they stood a chance. The active battle was over. Their role as combatants had ended in the smoke and thunder of that brief, brutal firefight. Their new role was just beginning, that of the hunted. And the war for Harlan County had just entered its next bloody chapter. The bullets fired at Evarts didn't stop when they hit their targets. They traveled onward, invisible and deadly, tearing through the fabric of the entire community. While the men who fired the guns vanished into the mountains, their families were left behind, exposed and vulnerable on the battlefield of the aftermath. They were no longer just the wives and children of striking miners, they were the kin of wanted killers. Doors were kicked in during the dead of night. Women were dragged out and interrogated by deputies whose faces were twisted with a new, vengeful fury. The battle drew a line of blood straight through Harlan County, a line that could never be erased. Before, the division was between strikers and scabs, a bitter but familiar conflict. After, it was between the families of the dead and the families of the killers. Neighbor turned against neighbor, their shared hardships forgotten, replaced by suspicion and a thirst for vengeance. Friendships that had endured a lifetime were severed with a single, hateful glance across a muddy street. The community didn't just break, it shattered into 1,000 sharp-edged pieces. The men on the hillside had fought to reclaim their dignity, to push back against an oppressive power. But their act of defiance gave that power the perfect excuse to tighten its grip. The governor declared martial law. The Kentucky National Guard rolled into the county, their trucks and machine guns a clear message. This was no longer a labor dispute, it was an insurrection. The miners had wanted to free themselves from the company's control, but their actions had brought an even greater power down upon them all, turning their towns and hollers into an occupied territory. The victory on the road was paid for by the hunger in the camps. With the men in hiding, the last trickles of income dried up completely. The women were left to fend for their children in a world that now saw them as pariahs. The small charities and local sympathizers who had helped them before were now too frightened to offer aid. The cost of that brief, violent stand was measured in the bellies of hungry children and the desperate, haunted eyes of their mothers. The tragedy of Evarts wasn't confined to the 4 men who died. It was a slow, creeping tragedy that would stalk the families of the living for years to come. The state of Kentucky did not respond with understanding. It responded with handcuffs and indictments. Dozens of miners and union organizers were hunted down, arrested, and charged with murder and conspiracy. The iron machinery of the law, a power far more methodical and relentless than a posse of gun thugs, was brought to bear. These men, who had lived their lives by a simple, brutal code of honor, were now dragged into a world they didn't understand, a world of courtrooms, lawyers, and the foreign language of affidavits and statutes. The trials were a spectacle, a perfect illustration of the clash between 2 Americas. On one side stood the prosecution, funded by the coal operators and backed by the state, arguing points of law and presenting a clean, simple narrative of a cold-blooded ambush. On the other side stood a miner in a borrowed suit, his hands still bearing the calluses of the coal face. When he spoke, he didn't use legal terms. He spoke of starvation. He spoke of his children's hunger. He spoke of the endless provocations by the company guards. His defense wasn't written in a law book. It was etched on the faces of his neighbors. He was essentially saying, "They pushed us until we had no choice but to push back." In that courtroom, it wasn't just the men on trial. It was the mountain code itself. And the jury was made up of men who understood that code. They were farmers and small merchants from the surrounding counties. They may not have worked in the mines, but they knew the arrogance of the coal companies. They knew what a gun thug was. They heard the legal arguments, but they also heard the unspoken truth of the miners' testimony. They looked at the accused and didn't see killers. They saw men exactly like themselves, pushed to the absolute limit. And then came the verdict in the first major trial. Not guilty. The word landed like a thunderclap in the silent courtroom. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. The state, with all its power and all its money, had failed to convince a jury of their peers that these miners were criminals. The verdict was a clear message from the community. The blame for the blood spilled at Evarts did not belong to the miners alone. It belonged to the system that had cornered them. Realizing they could never get a conviction, the prosecutors eventually dropped the murder charges against the remaining men. On paper, it was a victory for the Union, a moment of incredible triumph. But was it justice? The men were free, but the war was far from over. The gun thugs still patrolled the roads, the families were still starving, and the coal company's power, though challenged, had not been broken. The law had rendered its judgment, but the mountains had their own way of settling scores, and the violence in bloody Harlan was only just beginning. So, what became of the men who drove the convoy, the ones who held the whip hand? The law never came for Sheriff J.H. Blair. No grand jury ever convened to question the coal operators about the system of debt and violence they had created. While the miners were being hunted in the hills, the architects of their desperation sat safely in their offices, counting their profits and hiring more guards. The battle for them was not a tragedy. It was an inconvenience and a justification for even more brutality. In the immediate aftermath, their power seemed to grow. The presence of the National Guard gave them the cover they needed to systematically break the strike. Sheriff Blair and his deputies, far from being investigated, were emboldened. They now had a mandate to treat every Union man as a potential killer. The terror in Harlan County intensified, becoming a long, grinding war of attrition marked by ambushes and assassinations. For a time, it seemed the company had won an absolute victory. But history has its own form of justice, one that is often slow and ironic. By pushing the miners into open warfare, the operators had created a national spectacle. The name Bloody Harlan became a headline, a rallying cry for the labor movement across America. The stories of gun thugs and starving families brought congressional committees and federal investigators down into their closed kingdom. They had wanted to keep the Union out, but their methods put a spotlight on them so harsh that it eventually burned away the shadows they operated in. And Sheriff Blair, he became a symbol not of law and order but of corporate tyranny. Florence Reese, the wife of an organizer, wrote her defiant anthem, "Which Side Are You On?" while Blair's men were outside her house, ready to break in. The song outlived him. It outlived the mine operators. It became the voice of the struggle long after their names were forgotten footnotes. In the end, the company men won the battle and the immediate war, but they lost their anonymity. They had wanted to make an example of the miners, but in doing so, they had made a damning example of themselves, one that would be studied for generations as a lesson in greed and brutality. For the families of the men who fought at Evarts, the battle never really ended. A man's surname became his history, a brand that marked him and his children. For some, it was a badge of honor. They were the sons of the men who stood up. But for many, it was a curse. They found themselves blacklisted, unable to get work in any mine in the region. The only path forward was to leave. A quiet exodus began, as families packed what little they had and scattered, seeking a life in the factories of Ohio or the auto plants of Detroit, hoping to outrun the long shadow of a single day in May. The community itself tried to heal by forcing itself to forget. A heavy blanket of silence was pulled over the memory of the battle. People had to live together after all. The son of a miner who fought on the hillside might find himself working a shift next to the son of a company man who was in that convoy. To survive, they could not speak of it. The gunfight became a ghost, a presence that everyone felt but no one acknowledged. It was a peace built not on forgiveness, but on the shared conspiracy of never speaking its name, a wound that scarred over but never truly closed. The Battle of Evarts didn't bring the Union to Harlan. In fact, it kicked off the bloodiest phase of the Harlan County War, a brutal decade of assassinations and bombings. The operator's power seemed unbreakable, but the battle had changed something fundamental. It had proven that the miners would die before they surrendered completely. It had created martyrs. It had planted a seed of defiance that, watered with the blood of men like Jim Penland, would stubbornly refuse to die. When the New Deal and new federal laws finally gave the United Mine Workers the leverage they needed to come back into Harlan years later, they were building on the foundation laid at Evarts. The legends of that day were told in secret, inspiring a new generation to take up the fight. The power dynamic didn't shift overnight, but the battle was the first great crack in the dam. The gun smoke cleared in a matter of minutes, but the shadow it cast would stretch on for generations, a constant, haunting reminder of the price of dignity. If you drive the road that runs through Evarts today, you can still find the spot. The pavement is wider now, the old railroad tracks long gone, but the shape of the land hasn't changed. The hillside still rises steeply from the road, a silent, green witness. There are no monuments here, no bronze plaques to mark the spot where the battle was fought. The only memorials are the ones you have to search for. A weathered tombstone in a small mountain cemetery, the name Jim Penland worn smooth by a century of rain and sorrow. The most enduring echo of that day is the name it gave the county. Before the battle, Harlan was just another coal county. After, it was forever Bloody Harlan. The name became a brand, a piece of American folklore. To the outside world, it was a shorthand for violence, poverty, and backwardness. But to the people within, it was something more complicated. A source of shame, yes, but also a badge of a certain stubborn, dangerous pride. It was a reminder that this was a place where men would not be pushed too far. The story of the battle itself left the pages of the newspapers and passed into legend. It became a ballad, sung not with guitars, but in the quiet telling of stories from grandfather to grandson on a front porch at dusk. In these tellings, the miners were always braver, the gun thugs more evil. The rumor of a machine gun hidden in the woods grew into an accepted fact. The battle became a modern-day Thermopylae in the mountains, a story told to teach the young what it costs to stand up for yourself. And its anthem, born from the terror that followed, became Florence Reese's immortal question: which side are you on? That question still hangs in the air in Harlan County. The coal companies may not hold the absolute power they once did, the gun thugs are gone, but the fundamental struggle remains. The fight against outside forces that seek to extract the wealth from the mountains while leaving the people with nothing is a story that has never ended. It just changes its name and its face. The spirit of defiance that rose up on that hillside in 1931 is still there, sleeping just beneath the surface. The men who fought at Evarts are all gone now. Their bodies returned to the same earth they once mined. But their ghost has not left these hills. It's in the stubborn set of a jaw when a man is told he can't provide for his family. It's in the fierce, protective love for this hard land. And it's in the understanding that sometimes, when you're pushed to the wall, the only answer the world seems to understand is the roar of a gun. So we return to the question that started it all, hanging in the smoky air of 1931. Was the Battle of Evarts a heroic last stand or a villainous ambush? The truth is, it was neither. and it was both. These were not heroes in shining armor. Their actions brought a reign of terror and hardship down on the very families they sought to protect. But they were not villains. They were the inevitable product of a cruel and calculated system. They were what Harlan County had made them. Desperate men who had been shown time and again that violence was the only currency the company truly respected. The Battle of Evarts is a timeless, brutal lesson in what happens when you push a people past the breaking point. It teaches us that you cannot strip a man of his home, his wages, and his hope, and expect him to bow his head in silence. Sooner or later, he will stand up. This wasn't a clash of armies. It was a clash of worlds. The cold, mathematical logic of profit ran headlong into the hot-blooded, unwritten code of the mountains, a code where a man's honor was worth more than his life. The 4 men who died that day were only the first casualties. The battle's true toll was measured in the years of fear, the families broken apart, and the legacy of bitterness that stained the ground for a generation. It stands as a monument, not of victory or defeat, but as a testament to the explosive power of wounded pride. And that, my friends, is the ballad of Bloody Harlan. A story not about a wage, but about what a man will do when his dignity is the last thing he has left to lose. They say if you walk the old McCoy lands on a cold January night, when the wind moans through the bare sycamores, you can still hear her. A woman's voice, thin and full of sorrow, whispering 2 names into the darkness. Alifair Calvin. It's the ghost of Sarah McCoy, they say, the living curse of the great feud, a mother forever searching for the children who were murdered right before her eyes. But how does a person become a ghost while they're still breathing? How does a tough, resilient mountain matriarch, the very heart of a family, get broken so completely that her grief itself becomes a local legend? Hers is not a story of bullets and bravado. It's the story of what happens after the guns fall silent, and of a sorrow so deep it haunts the hills to this very day. Today, we separate the woman from the haint and trace the path that led Sarah McCoy into that long, lonely darkness. To understand the woman, you first have to understand the mountains that made her. Sarah Mullins was born in 1829 into a world of sharp ridges and deep, isolated hollows along the Kentucky side of the Tug Fork. This wasn't a land of easy living. It was a place that demanded everything from you: your strength, your sweat, your resilience. The seasons were harsh, the soil was rocky, and the outside world with its formal laws and governments was a distant rumor. Life was governed by a different set of rules: the turning of the seasons, the needs of the family, and the unwritten code of the hills. She was a Mullins before she was a McCoy, and like all mountain families, they lived by a simple, powerful creed: you take care of your own. Sarah's childhood wouldn't have been one of play and schooling. Her education came at her mother's side, learning the hard-won lessons of survival. She learned how to birth a child and how to bury one. She learned which roots could break a fever and which berries were poison. She learned to mend clothes, cure meat, and stretch a handful of cornmeal to feed a hungry family through the dead of winter. It was a life that forged a quiet, unbreakable strength into the very marrow of her bones. There are no documents that tell us of a single, defining moment in her youth. But the life of every mountain girl was filled with them. You can imagine a winter so fierce it threatened to starve the family out, and a young Sarah, not yet a woman, helping her mother keep a dying fire alive. You can picture her nursing a younger sibling through a sickness, learning for the first time that hollow-eyed fear that comes when a loved one's life hangs by a thread. These small, forgotten battles were her forge, tempering her into a woman who could endure hardship without complaint, because complaining was a luxury the mountains never afforded. In 1849, that quiet strength was joined with the formidable pride of Randolph McCoy. Randall, as he was known, was a stubborn, unbending man, quick to see a slight and slow to forgive a debt. When Sarah married him, she wasn't just becoming a wife, she was becoming the bedrock of a new dynasty. Her life's work would now be to build a family, to raise sons and daughters who carried the McCoy name. He was the stone wall facing the world. She was the mortar holding it all together, the quiet force that turned a rough log cabin into a home. Her code was not the code of the gunman or the feudist, not yet. Her code was the ancient, unspoken law of the Appalachian matriarch. It was a law written in the rhythm of a rocking chair, the smell of baking bread, and the fierce, protective glare she'd give anyone who threatened her children. Her honor wasn't tied to land disputes or stolen hogs. It was tied to the well-being of the 13 souls she brought into this world. Her domain was the hearth. Her ambition was a full pantry, and her loyalty was absolute, not to a cause, but to the lives she had created. Before the first shots of the feud echoed in her memory, Sarah McCoy's world was one of simple, profound purpose. Her domain wasn't the courthouse or the battlefield. It was a rough-hewn log cabin on a Kentucky hillside, a home that was overflowing with the noise and chaos of life. While Randall was out wrestling a living from the rocky soil or nursing a grievance with a neighbor, Sarah was the quiet gravity that held their chaotic world in orbit. The cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was her life's work, a testament to her endurance, filled with the smell of wood smoke and stew and the constant hum of her children's lives. And what a life it was. She was the mother of 13. Imagine that. 13 times she went through the trial of childbirth, and 13 times she held a new life in her arms. Her days weren't measured in hours, but in the tasks required to keep that many souls alive and well. It was an endless cycle of mending torn shirts, calming fevers with cool rags, breaking up squabbles between brothers, and singing the youngest ones to sleep. Her hands were never still. They were either kneading dough, churning butter, snapping beans, or gently brushing the hair from a sleeping child's face. She wasn't a woman given to grand pronouncements. Her strength was in her presence. When a child fell and scraped a knee, it was Sarah's lap they sought. When a son came home angry over some dispute, it was her steady gaze that could soothe the heat of his pride. She was the keeper of their stories, the witness to their growth. She saw the stubborn set of Randall's jaw in her son Tolbert, and the quiet kindness in her daughter Alifair. She knew their fears, their dreams, and the secret hurts they hid from the world. For 2 decades, that world, while never easy, was whole. The rhythm of their lives was tied to the land. There was the hard work of planting in the spring, the relief of the summer harvest, and the huddling together for warmth and stories in the long, dark winters. This was the world Sarah McCoy had built and fought to protect. It wasn't a kingdom of wealth or power, but it was rich in what mattered most to her, the sight of her family, gathered and safe, under one roof. Her treasure wasn't a plot of land. It was the sound of her children's laughter echoing through the holler. This was what was at stake. Not honor, not a family name, not the ownership of a stray pig. For Sarah, the escalating tensions with the Hatfields across the river were a terrifying threat to the only thing she held sacred. Every angry word Randall brought home, every dark rumor that drifted over the tug fork, was like a tremor beneath the foundation of her home. She was a mother standing guard over a precious, fragile peace, and she could feel a storm gathering on the horizon that threatened to wash it all away. Every great tragedy is driven by a fatal flaw, a crack in an otherwise strong foundation. For Randall McCoy, it was his unbending pride. For his sons, it was their quick, violent temper. But Sarah's flaw was something far more subtle and heartbreaking. It wasn't a sin, but a virtue taken to a terrible extreme. Her absolute, unconditional love for her family. Her love was so powerful, so all-consuming, that it blinded her to any path that required her to stand against her husband or her sons. She saw her duty not as guiding them, but as enduring with them, no matter the cost. We see this flaw in sharp relief after the tragedy of 1882. The Hatfields had captured 3 of her sons, Talbot, Farmer, and Randolph Jr., and, in an act of brutal frontier justice, tied them to pawpaw trees and executed them. The grief that fell upon Sarah's house was a physical thing, a suffocating shroud. This was the moment where a different kind of woman might have broken. She might have screamed at Randall, "Your pride has already cost me 3 sons. Are you waiting for it to take the rest?" She could have begged him to leave the valley, to sell the land, to save what was left of their family from the fire of his feud. But she didn't. Her love and her grief fused into a kind of hardened, silent resolve. To suggest leaving would have felt like a betrayal of her murdered boy's memory. To question her husband's path would have been to break the sacred code of a mountain wife. And so, she stood by him. While the men spoke of honor and revenge, Sarah's world was one of empty chairs at the dinner table and ghosts in every corner of the cabin. Her loyalty, once the family's greatest source of strength and comfort, now became the quiet engine of its destruction. She would support their fight, even if it led them all to the grave. This unwavering devotion was, for most of her life, her greatest strength. It's what allowed her to raise 13 children in the harshest of conditions. It was the bedrock on which the McCoy family was built. But in the face of a blood feud, that same strength became a profound weakness. It made her a passive participant in her own family's annihilation. She couldn't see that sometimes the most loving act is to say no more. She couldn't imagine a world where her family was separated or their honor was compromised, and that inability to envision a different future trapped them all on the path to ruin. And so, she supported Randall's stubborn refusal to back down. She nursed the anger of her remaining sons and tended to the family's wounds, all while the storm gathered closer. Her flaw was not malice or pride. It was a love so deep it couldn't admit the possibility of defeat or retreat. She was the heart of the family, and she would continue to beat in rhythm with it, even as that rhythm became a death march. Her love had built their home. Now that same love would inadvertently help burn it to the ground. For 5 long years after the pawpaw tree executions, the feud had become a war of whispers and shadows. The grief in Sarah's home was a constant, cold presence, but the open bloodshed had ceased. A fragile, unspoken truce held the valley in its grip, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. But in the winter of 1887, the McCoy clan, led by their kinsman and lawyer Perry Cline, made a fateful decision. They decided to fight the Hatfields not with rifles in the hollers, but with warrants in the courts. This was the spark that would ignite an inferno. Cline, who held a deep personal grudge against the Hatfields, used his influence to have old murder warrants from 1882 reissued in Kentucky. He then deputized a rough, fearless man named Bad Frank Phillips to hunt down the Hatfields responsible for killing Sarah's sons. To the outside world, this was the law taking its course. But in the mountains, this was a profound and unforgivable insult. It was seen as a coward's move, an attempt to use outside authority to settle a family matter. You didn't send a lawman to do a man's work. It was a direct challenge to the sovereignty of the Hatfield clan and their patriarch, Devil Anse. The affront became an invasion when Frank Phillips and his posse crossed the Tug Fork into West Virginia. They were armed, they had the law on their side, and they began to hunt Hatfields on their own soil. They captured several men, and in the process, a Hatfield ally was killed. The news of this invasion, this violation of their territory by a McCoy-led force, reached Devil Anse like a declaration of war. The fragile truce was shattered. The Hatfields' response would not be in a courtroom. It would be swift, total, and merciless. For Sarah, this news was not a victory. It was a death sentence. When she learned that the law was being used as a weapon, a cold dread must have settled deep in her bones. She, more than anyone, knew the nature of the men they were provoking. She had seen their brand of justice firsthand at the base of 3 pawpaw trees. While the men in her family may have felt a surge of righteous power, Sarah would have felt the earth begin to tremble beneath her feet. The point of no return had been crossed. The men had kicked the hornet's nest with the lawyer's boot, and she knew the swarm would be coming for her home. Her immediate visceral reaction wouldn't have been one of anger or pride, but of a mother's paralyzing fear. She would look at her daughter Alifair and her son Calvin, the 2 children who remained with her in that isolated cabin, and see them with new, terrified eyes. They were no longer just her children. They were the targets. Her fatal flaw, that unwavering loyalty, now chained her to this reckless course. She couldn't protest. She could only pray. The men had lit the fuse, and Sarah was left to do nothing but watch it burn closer and closer to her door. For the first time in 5 years, a dangerous kind of hope flickered in the McCoy men. With Frank Phillips and his posse raiding West Virginia, they felt the tide turning. Justice, or at least their version of it, seemed within reach. But the whispers that drifted back across the Tug Fork were as cold and dark as a winter creek. Friends and neighbors, men who knew the Hatfields not as names on a warrant, but as flesh and blood forces of nature, brought warnings to Randall. They spoke in low, urgent tones of men gathering at Devil Anse's command, of the cold fire they'd seen in Jim Vance's eyes. These weren't formal offers of peace. The time for that had long passed. These were the desperate pleas of a community that could feel the ground getting ready to shake. "Take your family and go, Randall," one might have said. "Go to Pikeville, anywhere, just until this blows over. A piece of paper won't stop a bullet." They were warnings born of experience, a deep mountain wisdom that understood that provoking a man like Jim Vance was like cornering a rattlesnake. You might have the right to do it, but you'd be a fool to expect to walk away unharmed. But Randall McCoy, his pride now buttressed by the authority of the law, was deaf to these pleas. To him, leaving would be running. It would be an admission of defeat, a betrayal of the sons already in the ground. "We have the law on our side now," he'd retort, his jaw set like stone. He mistook the warrants in his pocket for a shield, believing the outside world's rules now applied to this ancient, personal war. He and his remaining sons walked with a newfound confidence, blind to the fact that they were marching their families straight towards an open grave. Sarah saw it, though. She saw the truth not in Randall's defiant words, but in the silence that followed them. She saw it in the way neighbors averted their eyes, in the sudden quiet that fell over a room when she entered. She could feel her family being walled off, isolated by her husband's stubborn pride. The warnings the men ignored, she heard as a deafening roar. She knew the Hatfields. She knew what they had done to her boys at the pawpaw trees, and she knew they had done it without the pretext of a legal invasion. What would they do now, with their homes raided and their kinfolk dragged away in irons? Her path of no compromise was one of silent, terrified endurance. Every day that passed was another missed opportunity to flee. Every sunset that painted the winter sky felt like a final act. The cabin, once her sanctuary, began to feel like a trap made of logs and pride. While her husband saw their stand as a matter of honor, Sarah saw only the shrinking circle of safety around her children. The men were too busy listening to the lawyers and the deputies to hear the sound that Sarah heard every night in her sleep, the sound of approaching footsteps in the snow. And so, with every warning ignored, with every chance for escape dismissed, the certainty of a violent end grew. The feud was no longer a simmering conflict. It was a runaway wagon careening downhill, and the McCoy family was tied to the driver's seat. Their isolation was now complete. They were alone in their holler, surrounded by a world that was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable crash. The only question left was how terrible the wreckage would be. The final chance for peace didn't come with a white flag or a parley at the river's edge. It came in the dead of night, on New Year's Eve, 1887, inside the four walls of the McCoy cabin. It came not as a negotiation, but as a wife's desperate plea to her husband. The children were asleep, their breathing soft and even in the cold air. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the low moan of the wind outside, a sound that seemed to be whispering a warning. Sarah sat watching the fire, but she wasn't seeing the flames. She was seeing the faces of her sleeping children, Calvin and Alifair, and the image of them was superimposed over the memory of her 3 dead sons. The fear she had been swallowing for weeks finally rose in her throat, too powerful to be contained. She turned to Randall, who sat cleaning a rifle, his face a grim mask in the flickering light. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Randall, let's leave this place." He stopped his work, the sound of the oiled rag on steel falling silent. He didn't look at her. "Leave? And go where?" "This is our home, woman." But Sarah pressed on, her words tumbling out in a torrent of a mother's terror. "To Pikeville, just for a while. Let the lawmen do their work. The land will be here when we come back, Randall. The house will be here. But the children, I can't lose any more children." This was her one and only act of defiance, a desperate attempt to place the lives of her family above the honor of their name. For a brief, flickering moment, the iron in Randall McCoy's gaze seemed to soften. He looked over at his son, Calvin, a young man now, asleep by the fire. He looked at his daughter, Alifair, her face peaceful in her dreams. He saw the genuine, heart-stopping fear in his wife's eyes. This was the crossroads. He could choose his family, or he could choose his feud. He could choose life, or he could choose the dirt his ancestors were buried in. The entire weight of the McCoy family's future rested on the next words to leave his mouth. He shook his head, slowly at first, then with a final, terrible certainty. "And let them say I ran? Let Jim Vance and his murdering kin tell their children that Randall McCoy was a coward who abandoned his home and the graves of his sons." He stood up, his voice low and hard. "No, Sally. We are McCoys. We don't run." With that, the final door slammed shut. He had made his choice. He had chosen pride. Sarah said nothing more. She simply stared into the fire as the last ember of hope died, turning to cold, grey ash. The silence that filled the cabin now was the silence of a tomb waiting for its occupants. It started not with a shout, but with the sound of the world breaking. A splintering crash from the door, and then the night outside the McCoy cabin exploded. The family's dogs, which had been barking frantically, fell suddenly, horribly silent. The air turned to thunder. Flashes of orange light punched through the thin wooden walls, each one a deafening crack that seemed to rip the fabric of the cold January night. For Sarah, the world shrank to the terrified faces of her children, illuminated in strobing, violent bursts of light. The cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a cage. Then came a new smell, sharp and hungry. Kerosene. A sudden, whooshing bloom of light appeared at the windows and beneath the doors, painting the inside of the cabin in a ghastly, dancing orange. The dry roof caught with a hungry roar, and the heat became a living thing, a monster breathing down on them, driving them out into the open. Smoke, thick and acrid, filled their lungs, turning every breath into a choking gasp. The home Sarah had built with her own 2 hands was now a furnace, an altar for a terrible sacrifice. Her son Calvin, now a man, grabbed a rifle, his face a mask of desperate courage. He lunged for the main doorway, a silhouette against the rising flames, trying to give his family a chance to escape out the back. From the darkness came a single sharp report, a sound louder and more final than all the others. The argument that had been Calvin's young life was suddenly, permanently over. He simply crumpled and was gone from the doorway, leaving a void where her son had stood just a heartbeat before. A new sound cut through the chaos, Alifair's scream, raw with terror and grief. "Stop it! Please, stop!" She bolted from the smoke-filled room into the freezing yard, a desperate prayer on her lips, her hands outstretched as if she could physically push back the violence. Outside, in the hellish, flickering firelight, another shot rang out across the holler. The screaming stopped, just like that. In the snow, her daughter's frantic motion ceased, and a terrible, unnatural stillness took its place. Instinct, the purest and most primal force a mother knows, took over. Sarah scrambled out into the freezing air, her world narrowing to the still shape in the yard. She fell to her knees beside Alifair, a mother's wail tearing from her throat, a sound of absolute ruin. A dark shape loomed over her, a man's form silhouetted against her burning home. There was a swift, dark movement in the air above her. Not a sound, not a pain, just a blinding flash of white light behind her eyes. The world tilted on its axis. The roar of the fire and the crackle of gunfire faded to a distant, muffled hum. The cold, soft snow rose up to meet her, and the night, which had been so full of fire and noise, went utterly and completely black. The first thing she felt was the cold. Not the bracing cold of a winter night, but a deep, seeping cold that seemed to be coming from inside her own bones. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a slow, agonizing crawl out of a black, silent pit. There was a ringing in her ears, and the ground was wet beneath her cheek. The sharp, bitter smell of wet ash and burnt pine filled the air. For a moment, there was nothing else, just cold, silence, and the smell of ruin. Slowly, she pushed herself up. A crushing weight of pain exploded in her skull, a blinding agony that made the world swim. Her hand went to her head and came away slick and dark, with something that wasn't melted snow. Her eyes focused. Above her, the stars were still glittering, cold and indifferent. But where her home should have been, there was only a jagged black skeleton, its ribs smoldering faintly against the night sky. And then, she remembered, fire, gunshots, screaming. Her gaze fell upon a shape in the snow nearby, a dark bundle, unnaturally still. Alifair. The name was a thought, not a sound. Sarah crawled towards her, the pain in her head forgotten, her body moving with a will of its own. The snow beneath her daughter was stained a dark, impossible color. She reached out a trembling hand and touched her child's face. It was as cold as the frozen earth. A great, silent bell had been struck inside her soul, and the ringing had shattered everything. There was no scream, no cry. The sound was trapped somewhere deep inside her, unable to escape. Her eyes lifted toward the charred remains of the doorway. She saw him then, Calvin. What was left of him? The sight did not add to the horror. It simply confirmed it. The world had ended. This was what came after. She was no longer a wife or a mother. She was a witness, a survivor left behind in the graveyard of her own life. There was no triumph, no shock, no regret. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness where her heart had once been. She didn't flee into the mountains. She didn't stand her ground. She simply knelt there in the blood-soaked snow, a frozen statue between her two dead children, staring at the smoldering corpse of her home. Hours later, when the first grey light of dawn threatened the sky, Randall and the others who had escaped crept back out of the woods. They found her there. She looked at them, but her eyes were vacant, seeing something far away, or perhaps nothing at all. Randall had survived the night, but the woman he found in the ashes was not the wife he had left behind. The Sarah McCoy, who had raised 13 children and anchored a family, was gone forever, and in her place was only a ghost. The fire that consumed the McCoy cabin sent shockwaves of a different kind across the mountains. The immediate wreckage wasn't just timber and ash, it was human. Randall McCoy, a man whose pride had forbidden him from leaving his home, was now forced to lead a ragged procession of ghosts away from the Tug Fork. They were homeless, landless, and carrying with them a grief so heavy it was a physical burden. Their destination was Pikeville, a town that offered safety, but also the quiet shame of exile. They were refugees from a war they had helped start, driven from their ancestral land not by an army, but by the hatred of their neighbors. But the most profound piece of wreckage was Sarah herself. They had managed to save her body from the flames, but her spirit had been left behind in the snow with Alifair and Calvin. She was now a walking wound, a constant silent testament to the horror of that night. For her surviving children, the burden was twofold. They had to mourn the siblings they had lost, while simultaneously caring for a mother who no longer recognized them, who looked through them as if they were made of glass. Every meal they prepared for her, every time they led her gently back indoors from a wandering daze, was a fresh reminder of how much had been stolen from them. They hadn't just lost a home, they had lost the heart of their family. News of the New Year's massacre spread through the hollers, not like a rumor, but like a pestilence. This wasn't another chapter in the feud. This was something different, something darker. Ambushing armed men on a trail was one thing. Executing prisoners by a pawpaw tree was brutal, but it followed a certain grim frontier logic. But setting fire to a family's home in the dead of night and shooting down an unarmed woman and a boy in their own yard, that violated even the most primitive mountain codes. The attack shattered any local sympathy the Hatfields might have had. It transformed them from proud patriarchs defending their territory into a pack of midnight murderers. This singular act of brutality, intended to end the McCoy line for good, instead sealed the Hatfields' own doom. The story of the massacre and of Sarah's tragic state lit a fire under the authorities in Kentucky. The feud was no longer a local squabble. It was now a manhunt, sanctioned and funded by the state. Bad Frank Phillips's posse was no longer just a band of McCoy allies. It was the arm of the law, and its hunt for Jim Vance and the others became a relentless crusade. The fire didn't end the war. It escalated it into a final bloody chapter that would lead to pitched battles, arrests, and ultimately, the gallows. The tragedy, in the end, belonged to everyone. The ashes of the McCoy cabin were the funeral pyre not just for Alifair and Calvin, but for any hope of a peaceful resolution. It left a permanent scar on the community, deepening the lines of hatred and distrust that would poison the valley for another generation. The true wreckage wasn't a burned-out foundation on a Kentucky hillside. It was the countless broken lives, both Hatfield and McCoy, left behind in the wake of a single night of unimaginable violence. The New Year's massacre didn't just burn down a cabin, it set fire to the unwritten rules of the feud. The law didn't just cross the tug fork anymore, it kicked down the door. Frank Phillips and his posse, now acting with the full fury of the Kentucky government behind them, hunted the raiders with a vengeance. Several Hatfields and their allies were captured, bound, and dragged across the river to stand trial in Pikeville. To the state of Kentucky, this was the legitimate capture of fugitive murderers. To West Virginia, it was an armed invasion and a kidnapping. The clash was no longer just between two families, it was between two states. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Imagine that. A blood feud born of stolen pigs and mountain pride was now being debated by the highest legal minds in the nation. In a landmark decision, the court sided with Kentucky, ruling that they had the right to prosecute the captured men. It was a stunning moment. For the first time, the formal black-robed law of the outside world had officially superseded the ancient, bloody code of the mountains. The federal government had declared that the tug fork was not a border between two kingdoms, but simply a line on a map that justice could cross at will. The Pikeville courthouse became a theater for this culture clash. On one side stood the machinery of the law, prosecutors in starched collars, law books filled with complex language, and a judge who represented a power far greater than any clan patriarch. On the other side stood the accused, men like Ellison Cottontop Mounts. He was a rough-hewn product of the mountains, a man who lived by a code of loyalty to his kin and whose understanding of justice was likely settled with a fist or a firearm. He sat in the courtroom, a bewildered and defiant figure, as his fate was debated in a language he barely understood. The community was torn in two. For the McCoys and their sympathizers, who packed the Kentucky side of the courtroom, this was divine retribution. They didn't see Cotton Top Mounts the man. They saw the embodiment of the Hatfield clan, the face of the evil that had burned down Sarah's home and murdered her children. Every word of the prosecution was a vindication of their suffering. But across the river and among the Hatfield allies, the trial was seen as a sham, a legal lynching. They saw Cotton Top not as a criminal, but as a political prisoner, a scapegoat being sacrificed to satisfy a Kentucky vendetta. He was their martyr. The verdict, when it came, was as swift and certain as a Hatfield bullet. Guilty. The sentence was even more final. Death by hanging. The law, which had for so long been a distant and irrelevant concept, had finally bared its teeth. Its judgment was absolute, and it promised a public, orderly, and legal end to a man's life, a stark contrast to the chaotic, passionate violence that had defined the feud for decades. But was it true justice? That's the question that still hangs over the valley. Cotton Top Mounts was just a follower, rumored to be simple-minded, a man caught up in the powerful currents of clan loyalty. The masterminds of the raid, Jim Vance and Cap Hatfield, had escaped the noose. Vance was already dead, shot by Frank Phillips, and Cap would eventually be pardoned. The law had claimed its pound of flesh, and the hanging of Cotton Top Mounts officially marked the end of the feud. But for many, it felt less like a resolution and more like a final bitter irony. A war started by powerful men had ended with the execution of one of their weakest soldiers. So, what became of the men who brought hell to Sarah McCoy's doorstep? Did they face a reckoning of their own? The answer, like everything in this story, is a tangled mess of violence, irony, and unsatisfying justice. The fates of the Hatfield leaders show that in the mountains, the ledger of right and wrong is rarely balanced so neatly. Jim Vance, the old wolf of the clan, the man widely believed to have delivered the crippling blow to Sarah's head, met a fittingly violent end. He was hunted relentlessly by Frank Phillips, who pursued him not with a warrant, but with the cold fury of an avenger. In January 1888, just weeks after the massacre, Phillips cornered Vance in the woods. There was no trial, no judge. There was only a final, brutal shootout. Jim Vance, who had lived his life by the gun, died by the gun, his body left in the frozen wilderness. For the McCoys, this was the only kind of justice they could truly understand. But for the others, the law's judgment was far more elusive. Cap Hatfield, Devil Anse's hot-headed son and another leader of the raid, was a ghost to the law. He dodged posses and hid in the mountains until the political winds shifted. Thanks to the bitter jurisdictional disputes between Kentucky and West Virginia, Cap was eventually granted a pardon. He never spent a day in jail for the New Year's raid. In a twist of staggering irony, the man who had acted as judge, jury, and executioner in Sarah's yard went on to become a lawyer and land agent, living a long and prosperous life. He died an old man, a respected member of his community, the blood of that night, a distant, unpunished memory. And what of the patriarch himself, Devil Anse Hatfield? He was the man in whose name it was all done, yet he never faced a single legal consequence for the feud. He outlived Randall McCoy by a decade, transitioning from a feared clan leader to a successful timber baron. The Hatfields, far from being destroyed, became a powerful and influential family in West Virginia politics. On the surface, it seems Devil Anse won. But a strange thing happened in his old age. In 1911, this man who had seemed to fear neither God nor the law waded into the waters of Island Creek and was baptized. The image of the old feudist, his hands now trembling with age, seeking to wash away a lifetime of sin, suggests a man who was, in the end, haunted. He may have escaped man's law, but it seems he was making a final, desperate peace before facing a higher judgment. For the surviving McCoys, life in Pikeville was a long, quiet epilogue written in the ink of grief and exile. Randall, the proud patriarch who had refused to abandon his home, now lived out his days as a ferryman, a humbled and broken man. His children grew up under a long shadow, forever known as the feud McCoys. They couldn't escape the name. It was whispered in the general store, it followed them to school, it clung to them like the smell of wood smoke. Some tried to build new lives, to distance themselves from the bloody history, but the story was a brand on their family name, a legacy of loss they would carry to their own graves. Back in the Tugfork Valley, a strange and heavy silence descended. The hanging of cotton-top mounts had drawn a formal line under the conflict, and the community, exhausted by years of violence and fear, collectively decided to bury the memory. Neighbors who had once aimed rifles at each other from opposite sides of the river now had to pass on the same dusty roads, trade at the same stores. The only way to survive was to not speak of it. The feud became the great unspeakable trauma, a ghost in the attic that everyone knew was there, but no one dared acknowledge. The healing was not a process of reconciliation, but of willed amnesia, a fragile peace built on a foundation of unspoken horror. The power dynamics of the region had been permanently redrawn. The fall of the McCoys from the Tugfork was absolute. Their land was gone, their influence shattered, their name reduced to a cautionary tale. But for the Hatfields, the feud had the opposite effect. It cemented their legend and consolidated their power in West Virginia. They transformed their notoriety into political and economic capital. Devil Anse's sons became sheriffs, lawyers, and businessmen. The Hatfields, far from being destroyed by the conflict, had emerged as a formidable Appalachian dynasty, their success built, quite literally, upon the ashes of the McCoy homestead. And in the middle of this silent, shifting landscape was the memory of Sarah. While the men's names became synonymous with the fighting, her story endured as the symbol of its true cost. She was the ghost that haunted the community's silence. The men's legacy was one of pride, violence, and shifting power. Hers was a legacy of pure, inconsolable sorrow. Long after the last shot was fired and the last grave was dug, it was the image of the broken mother, wandering the hills and calling for her lost children, that served as the feud's most chilling and enduring epitaph. If you travel to the Tugfork Valley today, you can find the place where it all happened. The state has put up a historical marker, a neat metal sign that tries to tame the wildness of the story with dates and official language. But the sign isn't what holds the power of that place. A little farther in, you can still see the foundation stones of the cabin, half buried in the earth. And you can see the old well, its stone ring, a silent, hollow mouth in the ground. To stand there is an eerie experience. The air is heavy with a profound and unsettling quiet, and you can't help but feel you are trespassing on sacred, sorrowful ground. A few miles away, in a small cemetery, you can find their names carved into weathered stone. Randall lies there, and Sarah is beside him. Their graves are simple, unadorned, the final factual statements in a story that has since become a legend. People come from all over the country now, tracing the feud's bloody map from one site to another. They take pictures of the tombstones, treating them like relics of a distant, almost mythical past. But the names etched there, McCoy, Alifair, Calvin, are a stark reminder that these were real people, with real lives that were violently, tragically cut short. The story of Sarah, however, did not get buried in that cemetery. It seeped into the soil and became part of the folklore of the hills. Long after she died, people kept telling the stories. They weren't talking about Crazy Sally anymore. They were talking about a true spirit, a haint bound to the land by the force of her grief. Hunters moving through the woods at dusk would swear they heard a woman's voice carried on the wind, whispering those two names. Travelers would tell of a sudden, bone-deep cold that would settle over them near the old cabin site, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. Her tragedy has been transformed. It's now a key chapter in the American saga of the Hatfields and McCoys, a cautionary tale told to children about the poison of hatred. It has been written into books, acted out on television, and even sung about in mournful mountain ballads. The raw, private agony of one woman has become a public ghost story, a piece of our shared dark heritage. The world remembers the feud as a story of stubborn, violent men, but it is the ghost of Sarah McCoy that gives the legend its soul-chilling power. And so, she endures. Devil Anse, Randall McCoy, Frank Phillips, they are figures of history, their actions debated and analyzed. But Sarah is a figure of pure, human tragedy. She is the mother who lost everything, the woman whose mind was broken by a sorrow too great to bear. The men's spirits may rest in the ground, their battles long over. But her spirit, the spirit of a mother's eternal, inconsolable grief, that is the one that still truly haunts these mountains. So we come back to the question we asked at the beginning. How does a person become a ghost while they are still breathing? The life of Sarah McCoy gives us the terrible answer. She was neither a hero nor a villain in this legendary war. She was the battlefield itself. The men fought over honor, land, and pride, but it was on the terrain of her heart that the true cost was tallied. Her story strips away any romance from the feud and shows us the raw, ugly truth. The deepest wounds aren't made by bullets, but by the memories they leave behind. In the end, this is a story about the terrible math of hatred. It shows that in a conflict fueled by pride, the price is always paid by the innocent. It is a brutal lesson that a mother's love, the most powerful force in the human world, cannot shield her children from the consequences of the foolishness of men. The curse of Sarah McCoy wasn't supernatural. It was the simple, horrifying curse of survival, of being the one left behind to count the graves and remember the screams. The names Hatfield and McCoy are now written in history books, symbols of a uniquely American conflict. But while their war is long over, her sorrow endures. And that, my friends, is the true ballad of the Tugfork Valley. A story not of the men who fired the guns, but of the mother whose unending grief became the feud's most haunting ghost. On a moonless October night, deep in the West Virginia mountains, the forest held its breath. The only sound was the rhythmic lurch of a heavy train fighting its way up the grade. Flip, flap, flip, flap. Then, a brilliant beam of light sliced through the darkness, pinning a man to the tracks. In the next instant, the gorge erupted in a firestorm of gunfire that echoed off the ancient canyon walls. The newspapers called it a victory for law and order, the end of the notorious McGraw gang. But was that the whole truth? Tonight, we follow the echoes of that gunfire back in time. We'll push past the headlines and Pinkerton reports to the whispers in the hollows where these men were called something other than criminals. They were called heroes. We are going to find the truth behind the legend of the McGraw brothers and what really happened on the last fateful run of the train they called the flip-flap. Before the gunfire and the legend, there was just the hollow. Life there moved with the sun and the seasons, not the ticking of a pocket watch. Morning mist clung to the valleys like a shroud, burning off to reveal hillsides thick with rhododendron and ancient hardwoods. The air smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and pine. The only clock you needed was the ache in your back that told you it was time to rest, and the rumble in your belly that told you it was time to eat. This wasn't just a place. It was a world unto itself, governed by the creek, the forest, and the sky. At the heart of this world was the McGraw family's small plot of land, anchored by a cabin built from chestnut logs by their grandfather's own hands. It wasn't much by a city man's standards, just a few acres of stubborn corn, a spring house dug into the cool earth, and a porch that overlooked the whole valley. But to them, It was everything. Every stone in the chimney, every well-worn plank on the floor, was a testament to the family's sweat and survival. This land was their memory, their birthright, and their future, all tied up in one. The three brothers were as much a part of this landscape as the trees. Elias, the eldest, was the quiet one, with eyes that saw the world in lines and angles. He'd find strange patterns in the stars and could sketch a map of the surrounding ridges from memory that was truer than any government survey. Caleb, built like an ox, was the earth itself. His strength was a thing of local legend, but it was a quiet strength, used for felling timber and ploughing the rocky soil. And then there was Finn, the youngest. He was the creek, fast, wild, and unpredictable. He knew the woods so well it was said he could track a whisper, his laughter echoing through the trees as he hunted. They weren't outlaws. They were sons of the mountain, dreaming simple dreams. Elias hoped to one day build a proper school in the valley. Caleb wanted nothing more than to marry his sweetheart and raise a family on the land he loved. Finn just wanted the freedom of the hills, the thrill of the hunt, and the respect of his kin. They were bound not just by blood, but by a shared love for this simple, hard, and honest life. But then, the outside world came creeping into their hollow. It arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet clicks of a surveyor's tripod and the rustle of papers covered in words they couldn't understand. Men in clean city clothes walked their land, driving stakes into the ground and marking ancient trees with slashes of paint. They spoke of progress, of a great steel artery that would bring wealth to the mountains. They laid a deed on the McGraw's kitchen table, a piece of paper that they claimed overrode the decades of sweat their family had poured into the soil. Their father, a man who had faced down panthers and harsh winters, was broken by that piece of paper. The family lost the better part of their land, the very heart of their homestead, for pennies on the dollar. The surveyor's paint on the trees felt like a scar, and the rumble they soon heard in the distance, the sound of dynamite blasting a path for the railroad, was a constant, gut-wrenching reminder of their helplessness. The world they knew was being carved up and hauled away, one coal car at a time. And with every distant train whistle that cut through the quiet of the hollow, a cold, hard knot of resentment tightened in the hearts of the three McGraw brothers. That land wasn't just dirt and rock. It was a living history, paid for in blood and sacrifice. The first McGraw to set foot in that hollow was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, a man who had fought the British at King's Mountain. He was given the land as a grant, a reward for helping to forge a new nation. He didn't receive a tidy deed from a lawyer's office. He received a promise, which he then had to make real with his own hands. He cleared the timber, fought off panthers, and built a life from scratch, believing he had earned a piece of the freedom he fought for. His title wasn't written on paper. It was carved into the very landscape. A generation later, another war came to test the family's resolve. When the country split in two during the Civil War, these mountains became a hornet's nest of divided loyalties. Neighbors took up arms against neighbors. The McGraws, like many mountain folk, cared little for the politics of Richmond or Washington. Their loyalty was to their own kin and their own hollow. They refused to fight for a cause they didn't believe in, hiding their sons and their livestock from recruiters of both armies. This taught them a bitter lesson. When powerful men draw lines on a map, it's the common folk who bleed. It deepened their distrust of any authority that came from beyond their own ridgelines. Because of this history, a name like McGraw carried a weight as heavy as a blacksmith's anvil. It was more than just a name, it was a code. To be a McGraw meant you didn't bow to anyone. It meant your handshake was a binding contract, and your land was an extension of your own soul. You were expected to be quiet, neighborly, and God-fearing. But if someone wronged you or yours, if they took what was earned by the sweat of your ancestors, you were bound by honor to see it set right. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about balance. So when the railroad company came with its lawyers and its fraudulent deeds, They weren't just stealing property. They were spitting on the grave of that revolutionary soldier. They were dismissing the family's century of hardship and self-reliance as if it meant nothing. In the eyes of Elias, Caleb, and Finn, this wasn't a business transaction. It was a declaration of war. They felt the weight of their name, the gaze of their ancestors, and they knew that the code they lived by demanded a response. The roots of this feud ran far deeper than a single property line. They were tangled in the very soul of the mountains. But the McGraw's defiance, born of honor, wasn't shared by everyone. For every family that nodded in grim approval, there were two more who had already bent the knee. They'd taken the railroad's meager pay, moved into company shacks, and learned to keep their heads down. These folks saw the McGraws not as heroes, but as a threat, a dangerous reminder of a pride they could no longer afford. And this division created the perfect breeding ground for suspicion and bad blood to fester. The face of this division, the human face of the railroad's power in their valley, was a man named Jedediah Stone. Stone's family had been rivals of the McGraws for generations, always competing for the best bottomland or the biggest timber contracts. When the railroad came, Stone saw his chance. He became their local man, a land agent and foreman who walked with the swagger of borrowed authority. It was Stone who had delivered the final papers to the McGraw's father, and it was said he did so with a smirk on his face. He was one of them, but he had chosen a side. The tension first boiled over in public, right in front of Abernathy's general store. Jed Stone was bragging about the new survey lines, how they'd be running track right through the McGraw's old hunting grounds. Caleb, who was there to buy salt, overheard him. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway. The store went silent. Stone, emboldened by his new position, made the mistake of pushing. "Something on your mind, McGraw," he sneered. The fistfight that followed was short, brutal, and left Stone with a broken nose and a mouthful of dirt. He didn't get up until Caleb was long gone, but the hatred in his eyes could have set fire to the building. After that, the whispers started. They were quiet at first, traded over checkerboards and sacks of flour. Jed Stone and his cronies began to paint the McGraws as violent and unhinged. Caleb's got a temper that ain't natural, they'd say, and that Finn, he's half wild, spends more time in the woods than with decent folk. The rumors, like kudzu vine, began to snake their way through the hollows, choking the truth. Elias tried to cut through it with reason, even attempting to negotiate a fair price for timber from their remaining land. Stone, acting as the company agent, laughed and offered him a fraction of its worth, knowing they had no other way to get it to market. The insult was as sharp as a slap in the face. The poison had seeped deep into the community, turning old neighbors into quiet enemies and small grudges into deadly threats. It started with the whispers of the woods themselves. An old she-panther, whose territory was miles up the ridge, began to scream at dusk just beyond their clearing, a sound like a woman being murdered, a cry that made the hair on your arms stand up. One evening, the sunset bled across the sky in a shade of red so deep and unnatural that the old folks called it a blood sky, a sure sign that the earth was about to drink its fill. Even the wind seemed to change its tune, moaning through the pines, not with the familiar sigh of the mountains, but with a sound like a mother weeping for her lost sons. These were the old signs, the omens the McGraw's grandmother had taught them to heed, and they settled like a cold frost on their spirits. Then, the human omen arrived. He wasn't a railroad bull or a county sheriff. He was a man named Sterling, a detective from the Pinkerton Agency. He didn't ride in with a posse. He simply appeared one day at Abernathy's store, looking as out of place as a Bible in a saloon. He wore a dark city suit, a bowler hat, and his face was clean-shaven and pale. He didn't speak much, just bought some tobacco and sat on the porch, watching. But it was the way he watched that unnerved everyone. He didn't look at the mountains with wonder. He looked at them like a grid on a map. He studied the faces of the local men, not with curiosity, but with a cold, detached calculation, the way a butcher studies a side of beef. Elias saw him that day and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He was a planner, a man who understood strategy, and in Sterling's quiet, assessing gaze, he saw a different kind of mind at work. This wasn't a man who could be intimidated by Caleb's strength or charmed by Finn's smile. This was a patient hunter, a man who would use traps and wires and logic, not just guns. That night, Elias sat on his porch, the familiar ridges and stars offering no comfort. A profound and unshakable dread settled deep in his gut. He knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that the game had changed. They were no longer just striking back at a faceless company. A reckoning was coming, and the game was no longer theirs to control. The breaking point didn't come with a roar, but with the quiet, rhythmic scrape of shovels against sacred ground. Finn was tracking a buck high on the ridge when he heard it, an unnatural sound in the one place that should have been silent. Creeping through the underbrush, he froze. Below him, in the small clearing that held the McGraw family graves, a work crew was driving stakes. Jedediah Stone stood among them, pointing, directing. They were marking a path for the tracks, and the line went right through the weathered headstones of his grandparents. The cold dread he'd felt for months instantly turned into white-hot rage. He didn't run back to the cabin screaming. The fury was too deep for that. He walked, cold and deliberate, and his brothers saw the look in his eyes and knew. Together, the three of them walked back up the ridge. They weren't armed for a fight. Elias carried only the original tattered land grant from the war, a last, desperate appeal to history and honor. They found Stone's crew about to pry loose the first of the fieldstone markers. "Stop," Elias said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a judge. "This is consecrated ground. Your company's deed has no claim here." Jed Stone turned slowly, a smug, contemptuous grin spreading across his face. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near the oldest grave. "Your deed is a piece of history, Elias. This," he said, waving the company's official survey, "is the law. And the law says, I own every leaf, rock, and bone on this mountain. Now, I'm telling you for the last time, get off company property before I have you removed." He gave a sharp nod to one of his men, a hard-faced guard with a pistol holstered on his hip. That was the spark. Finn let out a choked cry of fury and lunged, not at Stone, but at the man reaching for his grandmother's headstone. In the same motion, the guard drew his pistol. A deafening crack echoed through the clearing, and Finn was thrown back, a dark red line blooming on his forearm. The sight of his brother's blood broke something in Caleb. The quiet, gentle giant was gone. In his place was a force of nature. With a roar that seemed to shake the very trees, he charged into the work crew. It was over in seconds. The sound of a man's jaw breaking under Caleb's fist was like a dry branch snapping. He threw one man into a briar patch and disarmed the guard before he could fire again. He grabbed Jedediah Stone by the shirt front, lifted him clean off the ground, and hurled him down the hillside. The crew scrambled away like frightened squirrels, dragging their wounded, leaving a silence broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing. The first blood had been spilled. And in that moment, standing over the desecrated graves of their ancestors with the scent of gunpowder in the air, the McGraws knew their old life was over. They weren't farmers anymore. They were fugitives. The familiar heavy rhythm began its count in the darkness. Flip-flap, flip-flap. It was the sound of opportunity, the dinner bell that had called them to work so many times before. From his perch high on the ridge, Elias watched the train's single headlight cut a weak yellow path through the night. Below, he saw the faint shadows of his brothers moving into position. The small, muffled blast of dynamite was perfect, sending just enough rock onto the tracks to stop the beast in its tracks. The train hissed to a halt, its steam sounding like a great sigh of relief. It was their signature, a symphony of steel and rock they had perfected. But as Caleb and Finn stepped from the cover of the rhododendron, the symphony stopped. A new kind of silence fell over the gorge, a silence that felt heavy, watched. And then, the night was torn open. A brilliant electric searchlight mounted on the engine's tender flared to life, a single blinding eye that burned away the shadows and turned Finn into a statue of terror. In that same frozen second, a whistle blew from the woods, and the gorge answered. It wasn't just gunfire. It was a solid wall of noise, a physical force that seemed to press in from all sides. From his ridge, Elias saw the tree line across the canyon erupt in dozens of angry, blinking stars. The sharp cracks of rifles and the deep boom of shotguns all blended into one continuous, deafening roar. He saw his brothers, caught in that merciless white light, suddenly stripped of their legendary status. They were just men, terribly exposed and tragically outmatched. The wooden walls of the mail car began to splinter and peel away under the assault, silent witnesses to the storm. Bullets ricocheted off the steel wheels with a high, mournful whine. A lantern hanging on a hook shattered, its brief flare of orange light swallowed by the chaos. The air, thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp leaves, was suddenly choked with the acrid, biting scent of burnt gunpowder. Men were shouting, their commands lost in the thunder, their cries cut unnaturally short. From his vantage point, a helpless god watching his world be unmade, Elias saw his brother Caleb become the focal point of the storm. The big man didn't run. He roared, a sound of pure, primal defiance, and stood his ground, his shotgun bucking against his shoulder, trying to provide a shadow for Finn to escape into. But there were too many flashes, too many angry hornets in the air. Then the great shadow faltered. Shadow. He didn't cry out. He simply folded, falling with a terrible slowness, a great stone monument toppling back into the earth from which he came. Finn, fast as a whisper, almost made it. He moved like a ghost through the strobing effect of the muzzle flashes, a phantom of the woods, even in this hellscape. He was just feet from the safety of the dark tree line when a single sharp crack cut through the din, and the ghost stumbled. His leg buckled beneath him, and he fell into the unforgiving beam of the searchlight, no longer a spirit of the mountain, but just a boy on the ground. His flight ended. The firing stopped as suddenly as it began. The ringing silence that rushed in was more terrifying than the noise it replaced. The searchlight continued its slow, indifferent sweep across the scene, illuminating the splintered wood, the pockmarked rocks, and the still, dark shape that had been Caleb McGraw. Elias lay flat against the cold stone of his lookout, the smoke burning his lungs, a ghost left behind to witness the slaughter of his family. For Detective Sterling, this was never about justice, and it was certainly not about honor. It was about solving a problem. From his temporary office in the county seat, surrounded by maps, train schedules, and telegraph reports, he saw the entire situation as a complex equation. The McGraw brothers were not men. They were a variable, an unpredictable disruption to the orderly flow of commerce. And his job, the job he was paid very well for, was to eliminate that variable. His initial attempts to hunt them had been a source of immense professional frustration. His best agents, men who could track a pickpocket through the most crowded city streets, were useless here. They stumbled through the woods like cattle, leaving a trail a blind man could follow. They were spooked by the silence, by the feeling of being constantly watched. Sterling quickly realized that trying to beat the McGraws in their world, by their rules, was a fool's errand. They were part of the mountain. He was not. It was a tactical disadvantage he could not overcome with manpower alone. That's when the switch flipped in his mind. He stopped thinking like a detective trying to catch a criminal and started thinking like an engineer trying to fix a faulty machine. If you can't get to the broken gear, you don't keep reaching for it. You change the entire mechanism. He decided that if you can't hunt the wolves in their den, you burn the whole forest down. His plan, the searchlight, the dozens of hidden riflemen, the coordinated telegraph signals, was never designed to be an arrest. It was an extermination, planned with the cold precision of a mathematician solving for X. The risk of a shootout during a capture attempt, the possibility of escape, the circus of a trial, these were all inefficient outcomes. The solution was overwhelming, inescapable, lethal force. And so, as the telegraph key in his office clicked out the final report from the gorge, targets neutralized, 1 KIA, 1 captured, assets secure, Sterling felt no thrill of victory. He felt no remorse. He felt a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction. It was the feeling an architect gets when a bridge holds its weight, the feeling a watchmaker has when the last gear clicks into place and the second hand begins its perfect, steady sweep. He didn't picture Caleb McGraw's body cooling on the tracks or hear the echo of the gunfire. He saw a closed file, a completed contract, a problem solved. He simply folded the telegram, made a neat entry in his ledger, and began drafting his final invoice for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. When the last echo of gunfire faded, an unnatural silence fell upon the gorge. It was a dead quiet, heavier and more profound than the peace that had preceded it. The only sounds were the soft hiss of steam from the wounded train and the slow drip of water from the rocks. The searchlight continued its steady, unblinking sweep, painting the scene in stark, ghostly whites and deep, inky blacks. Men in dark coats emerged from the trees, not with whoops of victory, but with the grim, methodical purpose of undertakers. This wasn't the aftermath of a fight. It was the cleanup of an execution. They found Finn first, trying to drag himself toward the darkness of the forest. The wild spirit that danced in his eyes was gone, extinguished and replaced by a glassy look of shock and pain. They hauled him to his feet, his wounded leg buckling, and bound his hands without a word. The phantom of the woods, the boy who could move like a whisper, was now just a prisoner. His world shrunk to the cold iron of handcuffs and the hard stares of his captors. He didn't struggle. He just stared past them at the still, dark shape lying by the tracks. That shape was Caleb. The great mountain bear lay still, his massive frame looking strangely out of place against the orderly lines of the railroad ties. The lawmen gathered around him, their lanterns casting flickering shadows that made it seem for a moment like he might still be breathing. But he was gone. His strength, which could bend a railroad spike and uproot a stump, had been no match for a dozen well-aimed bullets. He had died on his feet, a human shield, a final, futile act of love for his younger brother. High above, hidden by rock and shadow, Elias watched it all. He saw them bind Finn. He saw them stand over Caleb's body. A wave of grief so cold and sharp, it almost made him cry out, washed over him. But he choked it down, turning it into ice in his veins. He couldn't help them. To reveal himself now would be a fool's death, an insult to Caleb's sacrifice. His mind, the planner's mind, took over. He wasn't a brother anymore. He was a survivor, a witness, a memory. Without a sound, he backed away from the ledge and melted into the deep woods, disappearing into the one place they could never follow, a ghost swallowed by the mountain that had been his home. By dawn, the gorge was crawling with railroad detectives and county lawmen. The telegraph wires hummed with the news. The McGraw gang was broken. The official story, crafted by Sterling himself, was already being printed in the Charleston papers. They were described as a pack of bloodthirsty animals, and their end was hailed as a triumph for progress. A warrant was issued for the last remaining brother, Elias McGraw, and a bounty was placed on his head, $500, dead or alive. It was a fortune in these parts, a sum large enough to make a man forget all about loyalty, kinship, and the old mountain code. The news of the shootout didn't arrive in the hollows on the pages of a newspaper. It came in whispers, carried by a shaken trainman, then a track walker, spreading from cabin to cabin like a contagion. The stories were fractured and full of horror. The blinding light, the sheer volume of the gunfire, the sight of Caleb McGraw's body. Then came the official story, crisp and clean as a new dollar bill, printed in the Charleston papers that Jedediah Stone left in a stack at Abernathy's store. It spoke of a heroic police action against a gang of violent thieves. And just like that, a line was drawn straight through the heart of the community. At the store, the old pot-bellied stove became a silent border. On one side sat the company men, the foremen and railroad guards, drinking coffee and nodding along as Stone read the heroic accounts aloud. On the other side sat the old-timers, the farmers and miners whose families had been there for generations. They said nothing. They just stared into the flames, their faces hard and unreadable, the silence in their corner of the room more powerful than all of Stone's boasting. The church congregation split too. One faction prayed for the souls of the lawmen who had restored order, while the other half offered quiet, veiled prayers for the lost and the grieving. A deep and chilling fear settled over the hills. People had seen what the railroad and its hired guns were capable of. They had brought an army into that gorge, and the law had blessed it. Men who might have known the McGraw's movements, who might have been able to offer a truer account of what happened, suddenly developed terrible memories. When questioned by Pinkerton agents or the county sheriff, their answers were a chorus of "don't know" and "didn't see." It wasn't a conspiracy to protect the McGraw's legacy, it was a conspiracy of self-preservation. They understood the new math of survival. The railroad's power was absolute, and speaking the truth could get you fired, evicted, or worse. A blanket of collective silence was pulled over the hollows, smothering the facts of that night. But even in that suffocating silence, small acts of courage flickered like candle flames in a storm. An anonymous sack of cornmeal and salted pork was left on the porch of a distant McGraw cousin. The blacksmith, a man who had known Caleb since he was a boy, told Jed Stone his forge was too busy to shoe his horse and left the animal standing. These were quiet rebellions, tiny gestures that went unnoticed by the men in charge, but they were messages understood by everyone else. They were a signal that while the body of the community might have been broken, its spirit, the old mountain code of loyalty, was not yet dead. It was a spirit that would be tested to its absolute limit by the crisp new posters that soon appeared, nailed to the door of the store and the biggest trees in the valley, announcing the $500 bounty on Elias McGraw. The hunt for Elias McGraw began not as a noble pursuit of justice, but as a business venture. Detective Sterling, a man who believed in systems and efficiency, organized the posse. He knew his own Pinkerton agents were liabilities in this terrain, so he leveraged the bounty. The $500 reward drew a rough collection of men down from the hills, men with cold eyes and worn-out boots, who knew the ridges, but whose loyalty was only to the silver dollar. To lead this motley crew, Sterling appointed Jedediah Stone. Puffed up with a new sense of authority and burning with personal vengeance, Stone swore he knew every path and hideout Elias could possibly use. They set out with a confidence bordering on arrogance, a clumsy army crashing through a silent world. They were loud, their city boots snapping twigs and dislodging stones, their voices carrying for miles in the still mountain air. They were hunting a ghost, but they sounded like a herd of buffalo. The mountains, in turn, seemed to conspire against them. Sudden, chilling rains would turn the trails to mud, washing away any potential tracks. Thick fog would descend into the valleys without warning, swallowing landmarks and turning the men back on their own trails. They were outsiders, and the ancient landscape seemed to be actively resisting their intrusion. Days bled into a week, then two. The mood of the posse soured. The bounty hunters grew restless and suspicious of one another, each man fearing another would find the trail first and claim the prize. Jed Stone's confident boasts turned to frustrated curses as every certain location proved empty. The men began to feel the oppressive weight of the forest's silence. They started at every shadow, mistaking the cry of a hawk for a signal. The man they were hunting became less a fugitive and more a myth. They spoke of him in hushed tones around the campfire, calling him the Haint of the Ridge. Elias was no longer just a man on the run. He was the spirit of the mountain itself, and he was hunting them back. Their break came from a place of desperation, An old trapper, his family facing a hard winter, was quietly approached by one of Sterling's men. For a fraction of the bounty, paid in cash, he reluctantly drew a crude map on a piece of bark. It showed a forgotten network of limestone caves near the highest ridge, a place the old folks called the Devil's Pantry. It was a treacherous, hidden place, a perfect bolt hole. The trapper's information reignited the posse's hope. This was it. They had a destination. They had a trap to set. They approached the caves at dusk, moving with a caution they hadn't shown before. Spreading out, they formed a tight cordon around the main entrance, rifles at the ready. Stone and a few of the bravest men crept forward. Inside the mouth of the largest cave, they found the proof they needed: the embers of a fire, still faintly warm, and a single spent rifle cartridge lying on the ground. A wave of triumphant excitement shot through the men. He was here. They had him cornered. With a signal, they rushed in, their lanterns cutting through the subterranean darkness, their shouts echoing off the damp stone walls. The main cavern was empty. They searched every corner, every shadow, finding nothing. Defeat began to settle in until one of the bounty hunters noticed a faint draft